Section 33 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. Section 33. Mrs. Poyser has her say out, from Adam Bede, by George Eliot. Something unwonted must clearly be in the wind, for the old squire's visits to his tenantry were rare, and though Mrs. Poyser had, during the last 12 months, recited many imaginary speeches, meaning even more than met the ear, which she was quite determined to make to him the next time he appeared within the gates of the Hall Farm, the speeches had always remained imaginary. "Good day, Mrs. Poyser," said the old squire, peering at her with his short-sighted eyes, a mode of looking at her which, as Mrs. Poyser observed, allays aggravated her. It was as if you was a insect, and he was going to dab his finger-nail on you. However, she said, "Your servant, sir," and curtsied with an air of perfect deference as she advanced towards him. She was not the woman to misbehave towards her betters and fly in the face of the catechism without severe provocation. "Is your husband at home, Mrs. Poyser?" "Yes, sir. He's only in the rick yard. I'll send for him in a minute, if you'll please to get down and step in." "Thank you, I will do so. I want to consult him about a little matter, but you are quite as much concerned in it, if not more. I must have your opinion, too." "Hetty, run and tell your uncle to come in," said Mrs. Poyser as they entered the house, and the old gentleman bowed low in answer to Hetty's curtsy, while Toddy, conscious of a pinafore stained with gooseberry jam, stood hiding her face against the clock and peeping round furtively. "What a fine old kitchen this is," said Mr. Donnithorne, looking round admiringly. He always spoke in the same deliberate, well-chiselled, polite way, whether his words were sugary or venomous. "And you keep it so exquisitely clean, Mrs. Poyser. I like these premises, do you know, beyond any on the estate. Well, sir, since you're fond of 'em, I should be glad if you'd let a bit of repairs be done to 'em, for the boarding's in that state as we's like to be eaten up with rats and mice, and the cellar you may stand up to your knees in water in it, if you like to go down. But perhaps you'd rather believe my words. Won't you please to sit down, sir?" "Not yet. I must see your dairy. I have not seen it for years, and I hear on all hands about your fine cheese and butter," said the squire, looking politely unconscious that there could be any question on which he and Mrs. Poyser might happen to disagree. "I think I see the door open there. You must not be surprised if I cast a covetous eye on your cream and butter. I don't expect that Mrs. Satchel's cream and butter will bear comparison with yours." "I can't say, sir, I'm sure. It's seldom I see other folks' butter, though there's some on it as one's no need to see. The smell's enough." "Ah, now this I like," said Mr. Donnithorne, looking round at the damp temple of cleanliness, but keeping near the door. "I'm sure I should like my breakfast better if I knew the butter and cream came from this dairy. Thank you, that really is a pleasant sight. Unfortunately, my slight tendency to rheumatism makes me afraid of damp. I'll sit down in your comfortable kitchen. Ah, Poyser, how do you do? In the midst of business, I see, as usual. I've been looking at your wife's beautiful dairy, the best manager in the parish, is she not?" Mr. Poyser had just entered in shirt sleeves and open waistcoat, with a face a shade redder than usual from the exertion of pitching. As he stood, red, rotund, and radiant, before the small, wiry, cool old gentleman, he looked like a prize apple by the side of a withered crab. "Will you please to take this chair, sir?" he said, lifting his father's armchair forward a little. "You'll find it easy." "No, thank you, I never sit in easy chairs," said the old gentleman, seating himself on a small chair near the door. "Do you know, Mrs. Poyser, sit down, pray, both of you, I've been far from contented for some time with Mrs. Satchel's dairy management. I think she has not a good method, as you have." "Indeed, sir, I can't speak to that," said Mrs. Poyser in a hard voice, rolling and unrolling her knitting, and looking icily out of the window as she continued to stand opposite the squire. Poyser might sit down if he liked, she thought. She wasn't going to sit down. As if she'd give in to any such smooth-tongued palaver. Mr. Poyser, who looked and felt the reverse of icy, did sit down in his three-cornered chair. "And now, Poyser, as Satchel is laid up, I am intending to let the Chase farm to a respectable tenant. I'm tired of having a farm on my own hands. Nothing is made the best of in such cases, as you know. A satisfactory bailiff is hard to find, and I think you and I, Poyser, and your excellent wife here, can enter into a little arrangement in consequence, which will be to our mutual advantage." "Oh," said Mr. Poyser, with a good-natured blankness of imagination as to the nature of the arrangement. "If I'm called upon to speak, sir," said Mrs. Poyser, after glancing at her husband with pity at his softness, "you know better than me, but I don't know what the Chase farm is to us. We've cumber enough with our own farm. Not but what I'm glad to hear of anybody respectable coming into the parish. There's some as have been brought in as hadn't been looked on in that character." "You're likely to find Mr. Thurl an excellent neighbor, I assure you. Such a one as you will feel glad to have accommodated by the little plan I'm going to mention. Especially as I hope you will find it as much to your own advantage as his." "Indeed, sir, if it's anything to our advantage, it'll be the first offer of the sort I've heerd on. It's them as take advantage that get advantage in this world, I think. Folks have to wait long enough afore it's brought to 'em." "The fact is, Poyser," said the squire, ignoring Mrs. Poyser's theory of worldly prosperity, "there is too much dairy land and too little plough land on the Chase farm to suit Thurl's purpose. Indeed, he will only take the farm on condition of some change in it. His wife, it appears, is not a clever dairywoman like yours. Now, the plan I'm thinking of is to effect a little exchange. If you were to have the hollow pastures, you might increase your dairy, which must be so profitable under your wife's management, and I should request you, Mrs. Poyser, to supply my house with milk, cream, and butter at the market prices. On the other hand, Poyser, you might let Thurl have the lower and upper ridges, which really, with our wet seasons, would be a good riddance for you. There is much less risk in dairy land than corn land." Mr. Poyser was leaning forward, with his elbows on his knees, his head on one side, and his mouth screwed up, apparently absorbed in making the tips of his fingers meet, so as to represent with perfect accuracy the ribs of a ship. He was much too acute a man not to see through the whole business, and to foresee perfectly what would be his wife's view of the subject. But he disliked giving unpleasant answers, unless it was on a point of farming practice. He would rather give up than have a quarrel, any day, and after all it mattered more to his wife than to him. So after a few moments' silence he looked up at her, and said mildly, "What dost say?" Mrs. Poyser had had her eyes fixed on her husband with cold severity during his silence, but now she turned away her head with a toss, looked icily at the opposite roof of the cowshed, and spearing her knitting together with the loose pin, held it firmly between her clasped hands. "Say? Why, I say you may do as you like about giving up on any o' your corn land afore your lease is up, which it won't be for a year come next Michaelmas, but I'll not consent to take more dairy work into my hands, either for love or money, and there is neither love nor money here as I can see, only other folks' love of themselves. And the money as is to go into other folks's pockets. I know there's them as is born to own the land, and them as is born to sweat on it." Here Mrs. Poyser paused to gasp a little. "And I know it's christened folks' duty to submit to their betters, as fur as flesh and blood'll bear it. But I'll not make a martyr of myself, and wear myself to skin and bone, and worrit myself as if I was a churn wi' butter a comin' in it, for no landlord in England, not if he was King George himself." "No, no, my dear Mrs. Poyser, certainly not," said the squire, still confident in his own powers of persuasion. "You must not overwork yourself. But don't you think your work will rather be lessened than increased in this way? There is so much milk required at the Abbey that you will have little increase of cheese and butter making from the addition to your dairy, and I believe selling the milk is the most profitable way of disposing of dairy produce, is it not?" "Aye, that's true," said Mr. Poyser, unable to repress an opinion on a question of farming profits, and forgetting that it was not in this case a purely abstract question. "I dare say," said Mrs. Poyser bitterly, turning her head half-way towards her husband, and looking at the vacant armchair. "I dare say it's true for men as sit in a chimney corner and make believe as everything's cut with ins and outs to fit into everything else. If you could make a pudding wi' thinking o' the batter, it 'ud be easy getting dinner. How do I know whether the milk'll be wanted constant? What's to make me sure as the house won't be put aboard wage afore we're many months older? And then I may have to lie awake o' nights wi' 20 gallons o' milk on my mind, and Dingle'll take no more butter, let alone paying for it, and we must fat pigs till we're obliged to beg the butcher on our knees to buy 'em, and lose half of 'em with the measles. And there's the fetching and carrying, and you'd be a welly half a day's work for a man and horse. That's to be took out of the profits, I reckon. But there's folks that hold a sieve under the pump and expect to carry away the water." "That difficulty about the fetching and carrying you will not have, Mrs. Poyser," said the squire, who thought that this entrance into particulars indicated a distant inclination to compromise on Mrs. Poyser's part. "Bethel will do that regularly with the cart and pony." "Oh, sir, begging your pardon, I've never been used to having gentlefolks' servants coming about my back places, a making love to both the gels at once, and keeping 'em with their hands on their hips, listening to all manner of gossip, when they should be down on their knees a scouring. If we're to go to ruin, it shanna be with our back kitchen turned into a public." "Well, Poyser," said the squire, shifting his tactics, and looking as if he thought Mrs. Poyser had suddenly withdrawn from the proceedings and left the room, "you can turn the hollows into feeding land. I can easily make another arrangement about supplying my house, and I shall not forget your readiness to accommodate your landlord as well as a neighbour. I know you will be glad to have your lease renewed for 3 years when the present one expires. Otherwise, I dare say Thurl, who is a man of some capital, would be glad to take both the farms, as they could be worked so well together. But I don't want to part with an old tenant like you." To be thrust out of the discussion in this way would have been enough to complete Mrs. Poyser's exasperation, even without the final threat. Her husband, really alarmed at the possibility of their leaving the old place where he had been bred and born, for he believed the old squire had small spite enough for anything, was beginning a mild remonstrance explanatory of the inconvenience he should find in having to buy and sell more stock, with, "Well, sir, I think as it's a rather hard," when Mrs. Poyser burst in with the desperate determination to have her say out this once, though it were to rain notices to quit, and the only shelter were the workhouse. "Then, sir, if I may speak, as for all I'm a woman, and there's folks as thinks a woman's fool enough to stand by and look on while the men sign her soul away, I've a right to speak, for I make 1/4 of the rent and save another 1/4. I say if Mr. Thurl's so ready to take farms under you, it's a pity but what he should take this, and see if he likes to live in a house with all the plagues of Egypt in it, with the cellar full of water, and frogs and toads hopping up the steps by dozens, and the floors rotten, and the rats and mice gnawing every bit of cheese, and running over our heads as we lie in bed, till we expect 'em to eat us up alive, as it's a mercy they hadn't eat the children long ago. I should like to see if there is another tenant besides Poyser as 'ud put up with never having a bit of repairs done till the place tumbles down, and not then, only with begging and praying, and having to pay half, and being strung up with the rent as it's much if he gets enough out of the land to pay, for all he's put his own money into the ground beforehand. See if you'll get a stranger to lead such a life here as that. A maggot must be born in the rotten cheese to like it, I reckon. You may run away from my word, sir," continued Mrs. Poyser, following the old squire beyond the door, for after the first moments of stunned surprise he had got up, and waving his hand towards her with a smile, had walked out towards his pony. But it was impossible for him to get away immediately, for John was walking the pony up and down the yard, and was some distance from the causeway when his master beckoned. "You may run away from my word, sir, and you may go spinning underhand ways of doing us a mischief, for you've got old Harry to your friend, though nobody else is. But I tell you for once as we're not dumb creatures to be abused and made money on by them as has got the lash in their hands for want of knowing how to undo the tackle. And if I am the only one as speaks my mind, there's plenty of the same way of thinking in this parish and the next to it, for your name's no better than a brimstone match in everybody's nose. If it isna 2-3 old folks as you think of saving your soul by giving 'em a bit of flannel and a drop of porridge. And you may be right in thinking it'll take but little to save your soul, for it'll be the smallest saving you ever made, with all your scraping." There are occasions on which 2 servant girls and a wagoner may be a formidable audience, and as the squire rode away on his black pony, even the gift of short-sightedness did not prevent him from being aware that Molly and Nancy and Tim were grinning not far from him. Perhaps he suspected that sour old John was grinning behind him, which was also the fact. Meanwhile, the bulldog, the black and tan terrier, Alec's sheepdog, and the gander hissing at a safe distance from the pony's heels, carried out the idea of Mrs. Poyser's solo in an impressive quartet. Mrs. Poyser, however, had no sooner seen the pony moved off than she turned round, gave the 2 hilarious damsels a look which drove them into the back kitchen, and, unspearing her knitting, began to knit again with her usual rapidity as she re-entered the house. "Thee's done it now," said Mr. Poyser, a little alarmed and uneasy, but not without some triumphant amusement at his wife's outbreak. "Yes, I know I've done it," said Mrs. Poyser, "but I've had my say out, and I shall be the easier for it all my life. There's no pleasure in living if you're to be corked up for ever, and only dribble your mind out by the sly, like a leaky barrel. I shan't repent saying what I think, if I live to be as old as the old squire, and there's little likelihood, for it seems as if them as aren't wanted here are the only folks as aren't wanted in the other world." "But thee wouldna like moving from the old place this Michaelmas 12-month," said Mr. Poyser, "and going into a strange parish where thee knowest nobody. It'll be hard upon us both, and upon father too." It's no use worriting. There's plenty of things may happen between this and Michaelmas 12-month. The captain may be master afore then, for what we know," said Mrs. Poyser, inclined to take an unusually hopeful view of an embarrassment which had been brought about by her own merit, and not by other people's fault. "I'm none for worriting," said Mr. Poyser, rising from his 3-cornered chair and walking slowly towards the door. "But I shall be loath to leave the old place, and the parish where I was bred and born, and father afore me. We should leave our roots behind us, I doubt, and never thrive again." End of section 33. Section 34 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. Section 34. The Prisoners, from Romola, by George Eliot. In 1493 the rumor spread and became louder and louder that Charles VIII of France was about to cross the Alps with a mighty army, and the Italian populations, accustomed, since Italy had ceased to be the heart of the Roman Empire, to look for an arbitrator from afar, began vaguely to regard his coming as a means of avenging their wrongs and redressing their grievances. And in that rumor Savonarola had heard the assurance that his prophecy was being verified. What was it that filled the ears of the prophets of old but the distant tread of foreign armies coming to do the work of justice? He no longer looked vaguely to the horizon for the coming storm. He pointed to the rising cloud. The French army was that new deluge which was to purify the earth from iniquity. The French king, Charles VIII, was the instrument elected by God, as Cyrus had been of old, and all men who desired good rather than evil were to rejoice in his coming. For the scourge would fall destructively on the impenitent alone. Let any city of Italy, let Florence above all, Florence beloved of God, since to its ear the warning voice had been specially sent, repent and turn from its ways like Nineveh of old, and the storm cloud would roll over it and leave only refreshing raindrops. Fra Girolamo's word was powerful, yet now that the new Cyrus had already been 3 months in Italy, and was not far from the gates of Florence, his presence was expected there with mixed feelings, in which fear and distrust certainly predominated. At present it was not understood that he had redressed any grievances, and the Florentines clearly had nothing to thank him for. He held their strong frontier fortresses, which Piero de' Medici had given up to him, without securing any honorable terms in return. He had done nothing to quell the alarming revolt of Pisa, which had been encouraged by his presence to throw off the Florentine yoke, and orators, even with a prophet at their head, could win no assurance from him, except that he would settle everything when he was once within the walls of Florence. Still, there was the satisfaction of knowing that the exasperating Piero de' Medici had been fairly pelted out for the ignominious surrender of the fortresses, and in that act of energy the spirit of the Republic had recovered some of its old fire. The preparations for the equivocal guest were not entirely those of a city resigned to submission. Behind the bright drapery and banners symbolical of joy, there were preparations of another sort, made with common accord by government and people. Well hidden within walls, there were hired soldiers of the Republic, hastily called in from the surrounding districts. There were old arms duly furbished, and sharp tools and heavy cudgels laid carefully at hand, to be snatched up on short notice. There were excellent boards and stakes to form barricades upon occasion, and a good supply of stones to make a surprising hail from the upper windows. Above all, there were people very strongly in the humor for fighting any personage who might be supposed to have designs of hectoring over them, they having lately tasted that new pleasure with much relish. This humor was not diminished by the sight of occasional parties of Frenchmen, coming beforehand to choose their quarters, with a hawk perhaps on their left wrist, and, metaphorically speaking, a piece of chalk in their right hand, to mark Italian doors withal, especially as creditable historians imply that many sons of France were at that time characterized by something approaching to a swagger, which must have whetted the Florentine appetite for a little stone throwing. And this was the temper of Florence on the morning of the 17th of November, 1494. The sky was gray, but that made little difference in the Piazza del Duomo, which was covered with its holiday sky of blue drapery and its constellations of yellow lilies and coats of arms. The sheaves of banners were unfurled at the angles of the baptistery, but there was no carpet yet on the steps of the Duomo, for the marble was being trodden by numerous feet that were not at all exceptional. It was the hour of the Advent sermons, and the very same reasons which had flushed the streets with holiday color were reasons why the preaching in the Duomo could least of all be dispensed with. But not all the feet in the piazza were hastening towards the steps. People of high and low degree were moving to and fro with the brisk pace of men who had errands before them. Groups of talkers were thickly scattered, some willing to be late for the sermon, and others content not to hear it at all. The expression on the faces of these apparent loungers was not that of men who are enjoying the pleasant laziness of an opening holiday. Some were in close and eager discussion, others were listening with keen interest to a single spokesman, and yet from time to time turned round with a scanning glance at any new passer-by. At the corner looking towards the Via de Cerretani, just where the artificial rainbow light of the piazza ceased, and the gray morning fell on the sombre stone houses, there was a remarkable cluster of the working people, most of them bearing on their dress or persons the signs of their daily labor, and almost all of them carrying some weapon, or some tool which might serve as a weapon upon occasion. Standing in the gray light of the street, with bare, brawny arms and soiled garments, they made all the more striking the transition from the brightness of the piazza. They were listening to the thin notary Ser Cioni, who had just paused on his way to the Duomo. His biting words could get only a contemptuous reception 2 years and a half before in the Mercato, but now he spoke with the more complacent humor of a man whose party is uppermost, and who is conscious of some influence with the people. "Never talk to me," he was saying in his incisive voice, "never talk to me of bloodthirsty Swiss or fierce French infantry. They might as well be in the narrow passes of the mountains as in our streets. And peasants have destroyed the finest armies of our condottieri in time past, when they had once got them between steep precipices. I tell you, Florentines need be afraid of no army in their own streets." "That's true, Ser Cioni," said a man whose arms and hands were discolored by crimson dye, which looked like bloodstains, and who had a small hatchet stuck in his belt. "And those French cavaliers who came in squaring themselves in their smart doublets the other day saw a sample of the dinner we could serve up for them. I was carrying my cloth in Ognissanti when I saw my fine Messeri going by, looking round as if they thought the houses of the Vespucci and the Agli a poor pick of loadings for them, and eyeing us Florentines, like top-knotted cocks as they are, as if they pitied us because we didn't know how to strut. 'Yes, my fine Galli,' says I, 'stick out your stomachs. I've got a meat axe in my belt that will go inside you all the easier.' When presently the old cow lowed, and I knew something had happened, no matter what. So I threw my cloth in at the first doorway and took hold of my meat axe and ran after my fine cavaliers towards the Vigna Nuova. And 'What is it, Guccio?' said I, when he came up with me. 'I think it's the Medici coming back,' said Guccio. 'Bembe, I expected so.' And up we reared a barricade, and the Frenchmen looked behind and saw themselves in a trap. And up comes a good swarm of our Chiompi, and one of them, with a big scythe he had in his hand, mowed off one of the fine cavalier's feathers. It's true. And the lasses peppered a few stones down to frighten them. However, Piero de' Medici wasn't come after all, and it was a pity, for we'd have left him neither legs nor wings to go away with again." "Well spoken, Oddo," said a young butcher, with his knife at his belt. And it's my belief Piero will be a good while before he wants to come back, for he looked as frightened as a hunted chicken when we hustled and pelted him in the piazza. He's a coward, else he might have made a better stand when he'd got his horsemen. But we'll swallow no Medici any more, whatever else the French king wants to make us swallow." "But I like not those French cannon they talk of," said Goro, none the less fat for 2 years' additional grievances. "San Giovanni defend us! If Messer Domeneddio means so well by us as your Frate says he does, Ser Cioni, why shouldn't he have sent the French another way to Naples?" "Ay, Goro," said the dyer, "that's a question worth putting. Thou art not such a pumpkin head as I took thee for. Why, they might have gone to Naples by Bologna, eh, Ser Cioni? Or if they'd gone to Arezzo, we wouldn't have minded their going to Arezzo." "Fools! It will be for the good and glory of Florence," Ser Cioni began. But he was interrupted by the exclamation, "Look there!" which burst from several voices at once, while the faces were all turned to a party who were advancing along the Via de' Cerretani. "It's Lorenzo Tornabuoni, and one of the French noblemen who are in his house," said Ser Cioni, in some contempt at this interruption. "He pretends to look well satisfied, that deep Tornabuoni, but he's a Medician in his heart, mind that." The advancing party was rather a brilliant one, for there was not only the distinguished presence of Lorenzo Tornabuoni, and the splendid costume of the Frenchman with his elaborately displayed white linen and gorgeous embroidery. There were 2 other Florentines of high birth, in handsome dresses donned for the coming procession. And on the left hand of the Frenchman was a figure that was not to be eclipsed by any amount of intention or brocade. A figure we have often seen before. He wore nothing but black, for he was in mourning, but the black was presently to be covered by a red mantle, for he too was to walk in procession as Latin Secretary to the Ten. Tito Melema had become conspicuously serviceable in the intercourse with the French guests, from his familiarity with southern Italy, and his readiness in the French tongue, which he had spoken in his early youth, and he had paid more than one visit to the French camp at Signa. The lustre of good fortune was upon him. He was smiling, listening, and explaining, with his usual graceful, unpretentious ease, and only a very keen eye bent on studying him could have marked a certain amount of change in him, which was not to be accounted for by the lapse of 18 months. It was that change which comes from the final departure of moral youthfulness, from the distinct self-conscious adoption of a part in life. The lines of the face were as soft as ever, the eyes as pellucid, but something was gone, something as indefinable as the changes in the morning twilight. The Frenchman was gathering instructions concerning ceremonial before riding back to Signa, and now he was going to have a final survey of the Piazza del Duomo, where the royal procession was to pause for religious purposes. The distinguished party attracted the notice of all eyes as it entered the piazza, but the gaze was not entirely cordial and admiring. There were remarks not altogether allusive and mysterious to the Frenchman's hoof-shaped shoes, delicate flattery of royal superfluity in toes, and there was no care that certain snarlings at Medicians should be strictly inaudible. But Lorenzo Tornabuoni possessed that power of dissembling annoyance which is demanded in a man who courts popularity. And Tito, besides his natural disposition to overcome ill will by good humor, had the unimpassioned feeling of the alien towards names and details that move the deepest passions of the native. Arrived where they could get a good oblique view of the Duomo, the party paused. The festoons and devices placed over the central doorway excited some demur, and Tornabuoni beckoned to Piero di Cosimo, who, as was usual with him at this hour, was lounging in front of Nello's shop. There was soon an animated discussion, and it became highly amusing from the Frenchman's astonishment at Piero's odd pungency of statement, which Tito translated literally. Even snarling onlookers became curious, and their faces began to wear the half-smiling, half-humiliated expression of people who are not within hearing of the joke which is producing infectious laughter. It was a delightful moment for Tito, for he was the only one of the party who could have made so amusing an interpreter, and without any disposition to triumphant self-gratulation, he reveled in the sense that he was an object of liking. He basked in approving glances. The rainbow light fell about the laughing group, and the grave church-goers had all disappeared within the walls. It seemed as if the piazza had been decorated for a real Florentine holiday. Meanwhile, in the gray light of the unadorned streets, there were oncomers who made no show of linen and brocade, and whose humor was far from merry. Here, too, the French dress and hoofed shoes were conspicuous, but they were being pressed upon by a large and larger number of non-admiring Florentines. In the van of the crowd were 3 men in scanty clothing. Each had his hands bound together by a cord, and a rope was fastened round his neck and body in such a way that he who held the extremity of the rope might easily check any rebellious movement by the threat of throttling. The men who held the ropes were French soldiers, and by broken Italian phrases and strokes from the knotted end of the rope, they from time to time stimulated their prisoners to beg. 2 of them were obedient, and to every Florentine they had encountered had held out their bound hands, and said in piteous tones, "For the love of God and the Holy Madonna, give us something towards our ransom. We are Tuscans, we were made prisoners in Lunigiana." But the 3rd man remained obstinately silent under all the strokes of the knotted cord. He was very different in aspect from his 2 fellow prisoners. They were young and hardy, and in the scant clothing which the avarice of their captors had left them, looked like vulgar, sturdy mendicants. But he had passed the boundary of old age, and could hardly be less than 4 or 5 and 60. His beard, which had grown long in neglect, and the hair which fell thick and straight round his baldness, were nearly white. His thick-set figure was still firm and upright, though emaciated, and seemed to express energy in spite of age, an expression that was partly carried out in the dark eyes and strong dark eyebrows, which had a strangely isolated intensity of color in the midst of his yellow, bloodless, deep-wrinkled face with its lank gray hairs. And yet there was something fitful in the eyes which contradicted the occasional flash of energy. After looking round with quick fierceness at windows and faces, they fell again with a lost and wandering look. But his lips were motionless, and he held his hands resolutely down. He would not beg. This sight had been witnessed by the Florentines with growing exasperation. Many standing at their doors or passing quietly along had at once given money. Some in half-automatic response to an appeal in the name of God. Others in that unquestioning awe of the French soldiery which had been created by the reports of their cruel warfare, and on which the French themselves counted as a guarantee of immunity in their acts of insolence. But as the group had proceeded farther into the heart of the city, the compliance had gradually disappeared, and the soldiers found themselves escorted by a gathering troop of men and boys, who kept up a chorus of exclamations sufficiently intelligible to foreign ears without any interpreter. The soldiers themselves began to dislike their position, for, with a strong inclination to use their weapons, they were checked by the necessity for keeping a secure hold on their prisoners, and they were now hurrying along in the hope of finding shelter in a hostelry. French dogs, bullock feet, snatch their pikes from them, Cut the cords and make them run for their prisoners. They'll run as fast as geese. Don't you see they're web-footed?" These were the cries which the soldiers vaguely understood to be jeers and probably threats. But everyone seemed disposed to give invitations of this spirited kind rather than to act upon them. "Sandidio, here's a sight!" said the dyer, as soon as he had divined the meaning of the advancing tumult. "And the fools do nothing but hoot. Come along," he added, snatching his axe from his belt and running to join the crowd, followed by the butcher and all the rest of his companions except Goro, who hastily retreated up a narrow passage. The sight of the dyer running forward with blood-red arms and axe uplifted, and with his cluster of rough companions behind him, had a stimulating effect on the crowd. Not that he did anything else than pass beyond the soldiers and thrust himself well among his fellow citizens, flourishing his axe, but he served as a stirring symbol of street fighting, like the waving of a well-known gonfalon. And the first sign that fire was ready to burst out was something as rapid as a little leaping tongue of flame. It was an act of the conjurer's impish lad Lollo, who was dancing and jeering in front of the ingenuous boys, that made the majority of the crowd. Lollo had no great compassion for the prisoners, but being conscious of an excellent knife which was his unfailing companion, it had seemed to him from the first that to jump forward, cut a rope, and leap back again before the soldier who held it could use his weapon would be an amusing and dexterous piece of mischief. And now, when the people began to hoot and jostle more vigorously, Lollo felt that his moment was come. He was close to the eldest prisoner. In an instant he had cut the cord. "Run, old one!" he piped in the prisoner's ear, as soon as the cord was in two, and himself set the example of running as if he were helped along with wings, like a scared fowl. The prisoner's sensations were not too slow for him to seize the opportunity. The idea of escape had been continually present with him, and he had gathered fresh hope from the temper of the crowd. He ran at once, but his speed would hardly have sufficed for him if the Florentines had not instantaneously rushed between him and his captor. He ran on into the piazza, but he quickly heard the tramp of feet behind him, for the other two prisoners had been released, and the soldiers were struggling and fighting their way after them, in such tardigrade fashion as their hoof-shaped shoes would allow, impeded, but not very resolutely attacked, by the people. One of the two younger prisoners turned up the Borgo di San Lorenzo, and thus made a partial diversion of the hubbub. But the main struggle was still towards the piazza, where all eyes were turned on it with alarmed curiosity. The cause could not be precisely guessed, for the French dress was screened by the impending crowd. "An escape of prisoners," said Lorenzo Tornabuoni, as he and his party turned round just against the steps of the Duomo, and saw a prisoner rushing by them. "The people are not content with having emptied the Bargello the other day. If there is no other authority in sight, they must fall on the sbirri, and secure freedom to thieves. Ah, there is a French soldier! That is more serious." The soldier he saw was struggling along on the north side of the piazza, but the object of his pursuit had taken the other direction. That object was the eldest prisoner, who had wheeled round the baptistry and was running towards the Duomo, determined to take refuge in that sanctuary rather than trust to his speed. But in mounting the steps his foot received a shock. He was precipitated towards the group of signori, whose backs were turned to him, and was only able to recover his balance as he clutched one of them by the arm. It was Tito Melema who felt that clutch. He turned his head and saw the face of his adoptive father, Baldassare Calvo, close to his own. The two men looked at each other, silent as death. Baldassarre, with dark fierceness and a tightening grip of the soiled, worn hands on the velvet-clad arm. Tito, with cheeks and lips all bloodless, fascinated by terror. It seemed a long while to them. It was but a moment. The first sound Tito heard was the short laugh of Piero di Cosimo, who stood close by him, and was the only person that could see his face. "Ha ha! I know what a ghost should be now." "This is another escaped prisoner," said Lorenzo Tornabuoni. "Who is he, I wonder?" "Some madman, surely," said Tito. He hardly knew how the words had come to his lips. There are moments when our passions speak and decide for us, and we seem to stand by and wonder. They carry in them an inspiration of crime, that in one instant does the work of premeditation. The two men had not taken their eyes off each other, and it seemed to Tito, when he had spoken, that some magical poison had darted from Baldassarre's eyes, and that he felt it rushing through his veins. But the next instant the grasp on his arm had relaxed, and Baldassarre had disappeared within the church. End of section 34.
Section 35 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. Section 35. Oh, May I Join the Choir Invisible, by George Eliot. Oh, may I join the choir invisible of those immortal dead who live again in minds made better by their presence, live in pulses stirred to generosity, in deeds of daring rectitude, in scorn for miserable aims that end with self, in thoughts sublime that pierce the night like stars, and with their mild persistent urge man's search to vaster issues. So to live in heaven, to make undying music in the world, breathing as beauteous order that controls with growing sway the growing life of man. So we inherit that sweet purity for which we struggled, failed, and agonized with widening retrospect that bred despair. Rebellious flesh that would not be subdued, a vicious parent shaming still its child. Poor anxious penitence is quickly dissolved, its discords quenched by meeting harmonies die in the large and charitable air. And all our rarer, better, truer self that sobbed religiously in yearning song, that watched to ease the burden of the world, laboriously tracing what must be, and what may yet be better, saw within a worthier image for the sanctuary, and shaped it forth before the multitude, divinely human, raising worship so to higher reverence more mixed with love. That better self shall live till human time shall fold its eyelids, and the human sky be gathered like a scroll within the tomb, unread for ever. This is the life to come, which martyred men have made more glorious for us who strive to follow. May I reach that purest heaven, be to other souls the cup of strength in some great agony. Enkindle generous ardour, feed pure love, beget the smiles that have no cruelty, be the sweet presence of a good diffused, and in diffusion even more intense. So shall I join the choir invisible, whose music is the gladness of the world. End of section 35, recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 36 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13, Section 36. Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1803 to 1882, by Richard Garnett. Noteworthy also, says Carlyle, and serviceable for the progress of this same individual, wilt thou find his subdivision into generations. It is indeed the fact that the course of human history admits of being marked off into periods, which, from their average duration, and the impulse communicated to them by those who enter upon adolescence along with them, may be fitly denominated generations, especially when their opening and closing are signalized by great events which serve as historical landmarks. No such event, indeed, short of the Day of Judgment or a universal deluge, can serve as an absolute line of demarcation. Nothing can be more certain than that history and human life are a perpetual becoming, and that, although the progress of development is frequently so startling and unforeseen as to evoke the poet's exclamation, "New endless growth surrounds on every side, such as we deemed not earth could ever bear." This growth is but development, after all. The association of historical periods with stages in the mental development of man is nevertheless too convenient to be surrendered. The vision is cleared, and the grasp strengthened by the perception of a well-defined era in American history, commencing with the election of Andrew Jackson to the presidency in 1828, and closing with the death of Abraham Lincoln in 1865. A period exactly corresponding with one in English history measured from the death of Lord Liverpool, the typical representative of a bygone political era in the prime of other years, and that of Lord Palmerston, another such representative in the latter. The epoch thus bounded almost precisely corresponds to the productive period of the two great men who, more than any contemporaries, have stood in the conscious attitude of teachers of their age. With such men as Tennyson and Browning, vast as their influence has been, the primary impulse has not been didactic but artistic. Herbert Spencer, George Eliot, Matthew Arnold, and others have been chiefly operative upon the succeeding generation. Mill and the elder Newman rather address special classes than the people at large, and Ruskin and Kingsley would have willingly admitted that however eloquent the expression of their teaching, its originality mainly consisted in the application of Carlyle's ideas to subjects beyond Carlyle's range. Carlyle and Emerson, therefore, stand forth like Goethe and Schiller as the Dioscuri of their period, the two men to whom, beyond others, its better minds looked for guidance, and who had the largest share in forming the minds from which the succeeding generation was to take its complexion. Faults and errors they had, but on the whole it may be said that nations have rarely been more fortunate in their instructors than the two great English-speaking peoples during the age of Carlyle and Emerson. Of Carlyle, this is not the place to speak further, but writing on Emerson, it will be necessary to exhibit what we conceive to have been the special value of his teaching, and to attempt some description of the man himself, in indication of the high place claimed for him. It has been said of some great man of marked originality that he was the sole voice among many echoes. This cannot be said of Emerson. His age was by no means deficient in original voices, but his may be said with truth to have been the chief verbal utterance in an age of authorship. It is a trite remark that many of the men of thought whose ideas have most influenced the world have shown little inclination for literary composition. The president of a London free-thinking club in Goldsmith's time supposed himself to be in possession of the works of Socrates, no less than those of Tully and Cicero, but no other trace of their existence has come to light. Had Emerson lived in any age but his own, it is doubtful whether, any more than Socrates, he would have figured as an author. "I write," he tells Carlyle, "with very little system, and as far as regards composition, with most fragmentary result, paragraphs incomprehensible, each sentence an infinitely repellent particle." We also hear of his going forth into the woods to hunt a thought, as a boy might hunt a butterfly, except that the thought had flown with him from home, and that his business was not so much to capture it as to materialize it and make it tangible. This peculiarity serves to classify Emerson among the ancient sages, men like Socrates and Buddha, whose instructions were not merely oral, but unmethodical and unsystematic, who spoke as the casual emergency of the day dictated, and left their observations to be collected by their disciples. An excellent plan in so far as it accomplishes the endowment of the sage's word with his own individuality, exceptionable when a doubt arises whether the utterance belongs to the master or the disciple, and in the case of diametrically opposite versions, whether Socrates has been represented more truly by the prose of Xenophon or the poetry of Plato. We may be thankful that the spirit of Emerson's age, and the exigencies of his own affairs, irresistibly impelled him to write. Nevertheless, the fact remains that with him, man thinking is not so much man writing as man speaking, and that although the omnipotent machinery of the modern social system caught him, too, and forced him into line with the rest, we have in him a nearer approach to the voice, apart from the disturbing and modifying habits of literary composition, than in any other eminent modern thinker. This annuls one of the most weighty criticisms upon Emerson, so long as he is regarded merely as an author, his want of continuity and consequent want of logic. Had he attempted to establish a philosophical system, this would have been fatal. But such an undertaking is of all things furthest from his thoughts. He does not seek to demonstrate, he announces. Ideas have come to him, which, as viewed by the inward light, appear important and profitable. He brings these forward to be tested by the light of other men. He does not seek to connect these ideas together, except in so far as their common physiognomy bespeaks their common parentage. Nor does he seek to fortify them by reasoning, or subject them to any test save the faculty by which the unprejudiced soul discerns good from evil. If his jewel will scratch glass, it is sufficiently evinced a diamond. It follows that although Emerson did not write most frequently or best in verse, he is, as regards the general constitution of his intellect, rather to be classed with poets than with philosophers. Poetry cannot indeed dispense with the accurate observation of nature and mankind, but poetic genius essentially depends on intuition and inspiration. There is no gulf between the philosopher and the poet. Some of the greatest of poets have also been among the most powerful of reasoners, but their claim to poetical rank would not have been impaired if their ratiocination had been ever so illogical. Similarly, a great thinker may have no more taste for poetry than was vouchsafed to Darwin or the elder Mill, without any impeachment of his power of intellect. The two spheres of action are fundamentally distinct, though the very highest geniuses, such as Shakespeare and Goethe, have sometimes almost succeeded in making them appear as one. To determine to which of them a man actually belongs, we must look beyond the externalities of literary form, and inquire whether he obtains his ideas by intuition or by observation and reflection. No mind will be either entirely intuitive or entirely reflective, but there will usually be a decided inclination to one or other of the processes. And in the comparatively few cases in which thoughts and feelings seem to come to it unconsciously, as leaves to a tree, we may consider that we have a poet, though perhaps not a writer of poetry. If indeed the man writes at all, he will very probably write prose, but this prose will be impregnated with poetic quality. From this point of view, we are able to set Emerson much higher than if we regarded him simply as a teacher. He is greater as the American Wordsworth than is the American Carlyle. We shall understand his position best by comparing him with other men of genius who are poets too, but not preeminently so. In beauty of language and power of imagination, John Henry Newman and James Martineau, though they have written little in verse, yield to few poets. But throughout all their writings, the didactic impulse is plainly the preponderating one, their poetry merely auxiliary and ornamental. Hence, they are not reckoned among poets. With Emerson, the case is reversed. The revealer is first in him, the reasoner second. Oral speech is his most congenial form of expression, and he submits to appear in print because the circumstances of his age render print the most effectual medium for the dissemination of his thought. It will be observed that whenever possible he resorts to the medium of oration or lecture. It may be further remarked that his essays, often originally delivered as lectures, are very like his discourses, and his discourses very like his essays. In neither, so far as regards the literary form of the entire composition, distinguished from the force and felicity of individual sentences, can he be considered as a classic model. The essay need not be too severely logical, yet a just conception of its nature requires a more harmonious proportion and more symmetrical construction, as well as a more consistent and intelligent direction toward a single definite end than we usually find in Emerson. The orator is less easy to criticize than the essayist, for oratory involves an element of personal magnetism which resists all critical analysis. Hence, posterity frequently reverses, or rather seems to reverse, for the decision upon a speech mutilated of voice and action cannot really be conclusive, the verdicts of contemporaries upon oratory. What will our descendants think of the parliamentary oratory of our age? Asked a contemporary of Burke's, when they are told that in his own time this man was accounted neither the first nor the second, nor even the third speaker. Transferred to the tribunal of the library, Burke's oratory bears away the palm from Pitt and Fox and Sheridan. Yet, unless we had heard the living voices of them all, it would be unsafe for us to challenge the contemporary verdict. We cannot say, with the lover and Goethe, that the word printed appears dull and soulless, but it certainly wants much which conduced to the efficacy of the word spoken. Ach, wie traurig sieht in Lettern, schwarz auf weiß, das Lied mich an, das aus deinem Mund vergoltern, das ein Herz zerreißen kann. Emerson's orations are no less delightful and profitable reading than his essays, so long as they can be treated as his essays were intended to be treated when they came into print. That is, read deliberately, with travelings backward when needed, and frequent pauses of thought. But if we consider them as discourses to be listened to, we shall find some difficulty in reconciling their popularity and influence with their apparent disconnectedness, and some reason to apprehend that, occasional flashes of epigram accepted, they must speedily have passed from the minds of the hearers. The apparent defect was probably remedied in delivery by the magnetic power of the speaker, not that sort of power which wields at will the fierce democracy, but that which convinces the hearer that he is listening to a message from a region not as yet accessible to himself. The impassioned orator usually provokes the suspicion that he is speaking from a brief. Not so Emerson. Above all other speakers, he inspires the confidence that he declares a thing to be, not because he wishes, but because he perceives it to be so. His quiet, unpretending, but perfectly unembarrassed manner, as of a man with a message which he simply delivers and goes away, must have greatly aided to supply the absence of vigorous reasoning and skillful oratorical construction. We could not expect a spirit commissioned to teach us to condescend to such methods, and Emerson's discourse, whether in oration or essay, though by no means deficient in human feeling, nor of the blessed Glendoveer order, frequently does sound like that of a being from another sphere, simply because he derived his ideas from a higher world, as must always be the case with the man of spiritual, not, of course, with the man of practical genius. It matters nothing whether this is really so, or whether what wears the aspect of imparted revelation is but a fortifying of the natural eye, qualifying it to look a little deeper than neighboring eyes into things around. In either case, the person so endowed stands a degree nearer to the essential truth of things than his fellows, and the consciousness of the fact, transpiring through his personality, gives him a weight which might otherwise seem inexplicable. Nothing can be more surprising than the deference with which the learned and intelligent contemporaries of the humble and obscure Spinoza resort to his judgment before he has so much as written a book. This estimate of Emerson as an American Wordsworth, one who, like Wordsworth, not merely enforced, but practically demonstrated the proposition that one impulse from a vernal wood may teach you more of man, of moral evil and of good, than all the sages can, is controverted by many who can see in him nothing but a polisher and stringer of epigrammatic sayings. It is impossible to argue with any who cannot recognize the deep vitality of nature, of the 2 series of essays first published, and of most of the early orations and discourses. But it may be conceded that Emerson's fountain of inspiration was no more perennial than Wordsworth's, and that in his latter years his gift of epigrammatic statement enabled him to avoid both the Scylla and the Charybdis of men of genius whose fount of inspiration has run low. In some cases, such as Wordsworth's, the author simply goes on producing, with less and less geniality at every successive effort. In others, such as Browning's, he escapes inanity by violent exaggeration of his characteristic mannerisms. Neither of these remarks applies to Emerson. He does not, in ceasing to be original, become insipid, nor can it be said that he is any more mannered at the last than at the first. This is a clear proof that his peculiarity of speech is not mannerism, but manner, that consequently he is not an artificial writer, and that since the treatment of his themes as he has chosen to treat them admits of no compromise between nature and rhetoric, he has the especial distinction of simplicity, where simplicity is difficult and rare. That such is the case will appear from an examination of his earlier and more truly prophetic writings. Of these, the first in importance, as in time, is the tract Nature, commenced in 1833, rewritten, completed, and published in 1836. Of all Emerson's writings, this is the most individual and the most adapted for a general introduction to his ideas. These ideas are not, in fact, peculiar to him, and yet the little book is one of the most original ever written, and one of those most likely to effect an intellectual revolution in the mind capable of apprehending it. The reason is mainly the intense vitality of the manner, and the translation of abstract arguments into concrete shapes of witchery and beauty. It contains scarcely a sentence that is not beautiful, not with the cold beauty of art, but with the radiance and warmth of feeling. Its dominant note is rapture, like the joy of one who has found an enchanted realm, or who has convinced himself that old stories deemed too beautiful to be true are true indeed. Yet it is exempt from extravagance. The splendor of the language is chastened by taste, and the gladness and significance of the author's announcements would justify an even more ardent enthusiasm. They may be briefly summed up as the statements that nature is not mechanical but vital, that the universe is not dead but alive, that God is not remote but omnipresent. There was, of course, no novelty in these assertions, nor can Emerson bring them by a hair's breadth nearer demonstration than they had always been. He simply restates them in a manner entirely his own, and with a charm not perhaps surpassing that which others had previously invested them, but peculiar and dissimilar. Everything really Emersonian in Emerson's teaching may be said to spring out of this little book. So copious, however, were the corollaries deducible from principles apparently so simple, that the flowers veiled the tree, and precious as the tract is, as the first and purest draught of the new wine, it is not the most practically efficient of his works, and might probably have passed unperceived if it had not been reinforced by a number of auxiliary compositions, some produced under circumstances which could not fail to provoke wide discussion and consequent notoriety. The principles unfolded in Nature might probably have passed with civil acquiescence if Emerson had been content with the mere statement, but he insisted on carrying them logically out, and this could not be done without unsettling every school of thought at the time prevalent in America. The divine omnipresence, for example, was admitted in words by all except materialists and anti-theists, But if, as Emerson maintained, this involved the conception of the universe as a divine incarnation, this in its turn involved an optimistic view of the universal scheme totally inconsistent with the Calvinism still dominant in American theology. If all existence was a divine emanation, no part of it could be more sacred than another part, which at once abolished the mystic significance of religious ceremonies so dear to the Episcopalians, while the immediate contact of the universe with the deity was no less incompatible with the miraculous interferences on which Unitarianism reposed its faith. Such were some of the most important negative results of Emerson's doctrines. In their positive aspect, by asserting the identity of natural and spiritual laws, they invested the former with the reverence hitherto accorded only to the latter, and restored to a mechanical and prosaic society the piety of which men in the infancy of history had defied the forces of nature. Substantially, except for the absence of any definite relation to literary art, Emerson's mission was very similar to Wordsworth's, but by natural temperament and actual situation, he wanted the thousand links which bound Wordsworth to the past and eventually made the sometime innovator the patron of a return towards the Middle Ages. Emerson had no wish to regress, and, almost alone among thinkers who have reached an advanced age, betrays no symptom of reaction throughout the whole of his career. The reason may be that his scrupulous fairness and frank conceptions to the conservative cast of thought had left him nothing to retract or atone for. He seems to have started on his journey through life with his conservatism and liberalism ready made up, taking with him just as much of either as he wanted. This is especially manifest in the discourse The Conservative, 1841, in which he deliberately weighs conservative against progressive tendencies, impersonates each in an imaginary interlocutor, and endeavors to display their respective justification and shortcomings. Nothing can be more rigidly equitable or more thoroughly sane than his estimate, and as the issues between conservatism and reform have broadened and deepened, time has only added to its value. It is a perfect manual for thoughtful citizens, desirous of understanding the questions that underlie party issues, and is especially to be commended to young and generous minds, liable to misguidance in proportion to their generosity. This celebrated discourse is one of a group, including one still more celebrated, the address to the graduating class of Divinity College, Cambridge, published as The Christian Teacher, 1838. This, says Mr. Cabot, seems to have been struck off at a heat, which perhaps accounts for its nearer approach than any of his other addresses to the standard of what is usually recognized as eloquence. Eloquent, in a sense, Emerson usually was, but here is something which could transport a fit audience with enthusiasm. It also possessed the power of awakening the keenest antagonism, but censure has long since died away, and nothing that Emerson wrote has been more thoroughly adopted into the creed of those with whom external observances and material symbols find no place. Equally epoch-making in a different way was the oration on Man Thinking, or the American Scholar, 1837, entitled by Dr. Holmes, Our Intellectual Declaration of Independence, and of which Mr. Lowell says, "We were socially and intellectually moored to English thought, till Emerson cut the cable and gave us a chance at the dangers and glories of blue water." In these three great discourses, and in a less measure in The Transcendentalist and Man the Reformer, both in 1841, America may boast of possessing works of the first class, which could have been produced in no other country, and which, even though in Emerson's own phrase wider circles should come to be drawn around them, will remain permanent landmarks in intellectual history. These discourses may be regarded as Emerson's public proclamations of his opinions, but he is probably more generally known and more intimately beloved by the two unobtrusive volumes of essays, originally prefaced for England by Carlyle. Most of these, indeed, were originally delivered as lectures, but to small audiences, and with little challenge to public attention. It may be doubted whether they would have succeeded as lectures but for the personal magnetism of the speaker, but their very defects aid them with the reader. who, once fascinated by their beauty of phrase and depth of spiritual insight, imbibes their spirit all the more fully for his ceaseless effort to mend their deficient logic with his own. Like love in Dante's sonnet, Emerson enters into and blends with the reader, and his influence will often be found most potent where it is least acknowledged. Each of the 20 may be regarded as a fuller working out of some subject merely hinted at in nature, statues, as it were, for niches left vacant in the original edifice. The most important and pregnant with thought are history, where the same claim is preferred for history as for the material world, that it is not dead but alive. Self-reliance, a most vigorous assertion of a truth which Emerson was apt to carry to extremes, the majesty of the individual soul. Compensation, an exposition of the universe as the incarnation of unerring truth and absolute justice. Love, full of beauty and rapture, yet almost chilling to the young by its assertion of what is nevertheless true, that even love in its human semblance only subserves ulterior ends. Circles, the demonstration that this circumstance is no way peculiar to love, that there can be nothing ultimate, final, or unrelated to ulterior purpose, nothing around which, in Emersonian phrase, you cannot draw a circle. The Oversoul, a prose hymn dedicated to an absolutely spiritual religion. The Poet, a celebration of poetry as coextensive with imagination, and in the highest sense with reason also. Experience and Character, valuable essays, but evincing that the poetical impulse was becoming spent, and that Emerson's mind was more and more tending to questions of conduct. The least satisfactory of the essays is that on art, where he is only great on the negative side, art's inevitable limitations. The aesthetical faculty, which contemplates beauty under the restraints of form, was evidently weak in him. Representative Men, Emerson's next work of importance, 1845, shows that his parachute was descending, but he makes a highly successful compromise by taking up original ideas as reflected in the actions and thoughts of great typical men, one remove only from originality of exposition on his own part. The treatment is necessarily so partial as to exercise a distorting influence on his representation of the men themselves. Napoleon, for example, may have been from a certain point of view the hero of the middle class, as Emerson chooses to consider him, but he was much besides, which cannot even be hinted at in a short lecture. The representation of such a hero, nevertheless, whether the character precisely fitted Napoleon or not, is highly spirited and suggestive, and the same may be said of the other lectures. That on Shakespeare is the least satisfying, the consummate art which is half Shakespeare's greatness, making little appeal to Emerson. He appears also at variance with himself when he speaks of Shakespeare's existence as obscure and profane, such a healthy, homely, unambitious life being precisely what he elsewhere extols as a model. The first lecture of the series, Uses of Great Men, would seem to have whispered the message more vociferously repeated by Walt Whitman. Emerson was yet to write 2 books of worth, not illumined with the light that never was on sea or land, but valuable complements to his more characteristic work, and important to mankind as an indisputable proof that a teacher need not be distrusted in ordinary things because he is a mystic and a poet. The Conduct of Life, 1851, far inferior to his earlier writings and inspiration, is yet one of the most popular and widely influential of his works, because condescending more nearly to the needs and intelligence of the average reader. It is not less truly Emersonian, less fully impregnated with his unique genius, but the themes discussed are less interesting, and the glory and the beauty of the diction are much subdued. Without it, we should have been in danger of regarding Emerson too exclusively as a transcendental seer, and ignoring the solid ground of good sense and practical sagacity from which the waving forests of his imagery drew their nutriment. It greatly promoted his fame and influence by coming into the hands of successive generations of readers who naturally inquired for his last book, found the author, with surprise, so much nearer their own intellectual position than they had been led to expect, and gradually extended the endorsement which they could not avoid according to the book to the author himself. When the reason and the understanding have agreed to legitimate the pretensions of a speculative thinker, these may be considered stable. Emerson insensibly took rank with the other American institutions. It seemed natural to all that without the retractation or modification of a syllable on his part, Harvard should, in 1866, confer her highest honors upon him, whose address to her divinity school had aroused such fierce opposition in 1838. Emerson's views, being pure intuitions, rarely admitted of alteration in essence, though supplement or limitation might sometimes be found advisable. The Civil War, for instance, could not but convince him that in his zeal for the independence of the individual, he had dangerously impaired the necessary authority of government. His attitude throughout this great contest was the ideal of self-sacrificing patriotism. In truth, it might be said of him, as of so few men of genius, that you could not find a situation for him, public or private, whose obligations he was not certain to fulfill. He had previously given proof of his insight into another nation by his English Traits, mainly founded upon the visit he had paid to England in 1847-1848, a book to be read with equal pleasure and profit by the nation of which and by the nation for which it was written, while its insight, sanity, and kindliness justify what has been said on occasion of another of Emerson's writings. The ideologist judges the man of action more shrewdly and justly than the man of action judges the ideologist. This was the secret of Napoleon's bitter animosity to ideologists. He felt instinctively that the man of ideas could see into him and through him, and recognize and declare his place in the scheme of the universe as an astronomer might a planet's. He would have wished to be an incalculable, original, elemental force, and it vexed him to feel that he was something whose course could be mapped and whose constitution defined by a mere mortal like a Coleridge or a de Stael, who could treat him like the incarnate thought he was, and show him, as Emerson showed the banker, that he also was a phantom walking and working amid phantoms, and that he need only ask a question or two beyond his daily questions to find his solid universe proving dim and impalpable before his sense. The later writings of Emerson, though exhibiting few or no traces of mental decay, are in general repetitions, or at least confirmations, of what had once been announcements and discoveries. This can scarcely be otherwise when the mind's productions are derived from its own stuff and substance. Emerson's contemporary Longfellow could renovate and indeed augment his poetical power by resort in his old age to Italy, but change of environment brings no reinforcement of energy to the speculative thinker. Events, however, may come to his aid, and when Emerson was called before the people by a momentous incident like the death of President Lincoln, he rose fully to the height of the occasion. His last verses, also, are among his best. We have spoken of him as primarily and above all things a poet, but his claim to that great distinction is to be sought rather in the poetical spirit which informs all his really inspired writings than in the comparatively restricted region of rhyme and meter. It might have been otherwise. Many of his detached passages are the very best things in verse yet written in America. But though a maker, he is not a fashioner. The artistic instinct is deficient in him. He is seldom capable of combining his thoughts into a harmonious whole. No one's expression is better when he aims at conveying a single thought with gnomic terseness, as in the mottos to his essays. Few are more obscure when he attempts continuous composition. Sometimes, as in the admirable stanzas on the Bunker Hill dedication, the subject has enforced the due clearness and compression of thought. Sometimes, as in the glorious lines beginning not from a vain or shallow thought, he is guided unerringly by a divine rapture. In one instance at least, the Rhodora, where he is writing of beauty, the instinct of beauty has given his lines the symmetry as well as the sparkle of the diamond. Could he have always written like this, he would have been supreme among American poets in meter. As it is, comparison seems unfair both to him and to them. What we have to learn from Emerson is chiefly the divine immanence in the world, with all its corollaries, no discovery of his, but restated by him in the fashion most suitable to his age, and with a cogency and attractiveness rivaled by no contemporary. If we tried to sum up his message in a phrase, we might perhaps find this in Keats's famous "Beauty is truth, truth beauty." Only, while Keats was evidently more concerned for beauty than for truth, Emerson held an impartial balance. These are with him the tests of each other. Whatever is really true is also beautiful. Whatever is really beautiful is also true. Hence is a special value to a world whose more refined spirits are continually setting up types of aesthetic beauty which must needs be delusive, as discordant with beauty contemplated under the aspect of morality, while the mass never think of bringing social and political arrangements to the no less infallible test of conformity to an ideally beautiful standard. Hence, the seeming idealist is of all men the most practical, and Emerson's gospel of beauty should be especially precious to a country like his own, where circumstances must for so long tell in favor of the more material phases of civilization. Even more important is that aspect of his teaching which deals with the unalterableness of spiritual laws, the impossibility of evading truth and fact in the long run, or of wronging anyone without at the same time wronging oneself. Happy would it be for the United States if Emerson's essay on compensation in particular could be impressed upon the conscience, where there is any, of every political leader, and interwoven with the very texture of the mind of every one who has a vote to cast at the polls. The special adaptation of Emerson's teaching to the needs of America is nevertheless far from the greatest obligation under which he has laid his countrymen. His greatest service is to have embodied a specially American type of thought and feeling. It is the test of real greatness in a nation to be individual, to produce something in the world of intellect peculiar to itself and indefeasibly its own. Such intellectual growths were indeed to be found in America before Emerson's time, but they were not of the highest class. Franklin was a great sage, but his wisdom was worldly wisdom. Emerson gives us, in his own phrase, morality on fire with emotion, the only morality which, in the long run, will really influence the heart of man. Man is, after all, too noble a being to be permanently actuated by enlightened selfishness, and when we compare Emerson with even so truly eminent a character as Franklin, we see, as he saw when he compared Carlyle with Johnson, how great a stride forward his country had taken in the meantime. But he could do for America what Carlyle could not do for Great Britain, for it was done already. He could and did create a type of wisdom especially national, as distinctive of the West as Buddhas of the East. R. Garnett. End of section 36. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Section 37 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. Section 37. Selected excerpts by Ralph Waldo Emerson. The Times. From the Lecture on the Times, 1841. But the subject of the times is not an abstract question. We talk of the world, but we mean a few men and women. If you speak of the age, you mean your own platoon of people, as Dante and Milton painted in Colossal their platoons and called them heaven and hell. In our idea of progress, we do not go out of this personal picture. We do not think that the sky will be bluer or honey sweeter, or our climate more temperate, but only that our relation to our fellows will be simpler and happier. What is the reason to be given for this extreme attraction which persons have for us, but that they are the age? They are the results of the past. They are the heralds of the future. They indicate, these witty, suffering, blushing, intimidating figures of the only race in which there are individuals or changes, how far on the fate has gone, and what it drives at. As trees make scenery and constitute the hospitality of the landscape, so persons are the world to persons. These are the pungent instructors who thrill the heart of each of us and make all other teaching formal and cold. How I follow them with aching heart, with pining desire. I count myself nothing before them. I would die for them with joy. They can do what they will with me. How they lash us with those tongues. How they make the tears start, make us blush and turn pale, and lap us in Elysium to soothing dreams and castles in the air. By tones of triumph, of dear love, by threats, by pride that freezes, these have the skill to make the world look bleak and inhospitable, or seem the nest of tenderness and joy. I do not wonder at the miracles which poetry attributes to the music of Orpheus, when I remember what I have experienced from the varied notes of the human voice. They are an incalculable energy, which countervails all other forces in nature, because they are the channel of supernatural powers. There is no interest or institution so poor and withered, but if a new strong man could be born into it, he would immediately redeem and replace it. A personal ascendancy, that is the only fact much worth considering. I remember some years ago, somebody shocked a circle of friends of order here in Boston, who supposed that our people were identified with their religious denominations, by declaring that an eloquent man, let him be of what sect soever, would be ordained at once in one of our metropolitan churches. To be sure he would, and not only in ours, but in any church, mosque, or temple on the planet. But he must be eloquent, able to supplant our method and classification by the superior beauty of his own. Every fact we have was brought here by some person, and there is none that will not change and pass away before a person whose nature is broader than the person whom the fact in question represents. And so I find the age walking about in happy and hopeful natures, in strong eyes and pleasant thoughts, and think I read it nearer and truer so than in the statute book or in the investments of capital, which rather celebrate with mournful music the obsequies of the last age. In the brain of a fanatic, in the wild hope of a mountain boy, called by city boys very ignorant, because they do not know what his hope has certainly apprised him shall be, in the love-glance of a girl, in the hair-splitting conscientiousness of some eccentric person who has found some new scruple to embarrass himself and his neighbors withal, is to be found that which shall constitute the times to come, more than in the now organized and accredited oracles. For whatever is affirmative and now advancing contains it. I think that only is real which men love and rejoice in, not what they tolerate, but what they choose, what they embrace and avow, and not the things which chill, benumb, and terrify them. And so, why not draw for these times a portrait gallery? Let us paint the painters, whilst the daguerreotypist, with camera obscura and silver plate, begins now to traverse the land. Let us set up our camera also, and let the sun paint the people. Let us paint the agitator, and the man of the old school, and the member of Congress, and the college professor, the formidable editor, the priest and reformer, the contemplative girl, and the fair aspirant for fashion and opportunities, the woman of the world who is tried and knows. Let us examine how well she knows. Could we indicate the indicators, indicate those who most accurately represent every good and evil tendency of the general mind, in the just order which they take on this canvas of time, so that all witnesses should recognize a spiritual law, as each well-known form flitted for a moment across the wall, we should have a series of sketches which would report to the next ages the color and quality of ours. Certainly, I think if this were done, there would be much to admire as well as to condemn. Souls of as lofty a port as any in Greek or Roman fame might appear, men of great heart, of strong hand, and of persuasive speech, subtle thinkers, and men of wide sympathy, and an apprehension which looks over all history and everywhere recognizes its own. To be sure, there will be fragments and hints of men, more than enough, bloated promises which end in nothing or little. and then truly great men, but with some defect in their composition, which neutralizes their whole force. Here is a Damascus blade, such as you may search through nature in vain to parallel, laid up on the shelf in some village to rust and ruin. And how many seem not quite available for that idea which they represent? Now and then comes a bolder spirit, I should say a more surrendered soul, more informed and led by God, which is much in advance of the rest, quite beyond their sympathy, but predicts what shall soon be the general fullness, as when we stand by the seashore, whilst the tide is coming in. A wave comes up the beach far higher than any foregoing one, and recedes, and for a long while none comes up to that mark, but after some time the whole sea is there and beyond it. Friendship. Friendship may be said to require natures so rare and costly, each so well-tempered and so happily adapted, and withal so circumstanced. For even in that particular, a poet says, love demands that the parties be altogether paired, that its satisfaction can very seldom be assured. It cannot subsist in its perfection, say some of those who are learned in this warm lore of the heart, betwixt more than two. I am not quite so strict in my terms, perhaps because I have never known so high a fellowship as others. I please my imagination more with a circle of godlike men and women, variously related to each other, and between whom subsists a lofty intelligence. But I find this law of 1-to-1 peremptory for conversation, which is the practice and consummation of friendship. Do not mix waters too much. The best mix as ill as good and bad. You shall have very useful and cheering discourse at several times with 2 several men, but let all 3 of you come together, and you shall not have one new and hearty word. 2 may talk, and 1 may hear, but 3 cannot take part in a conversation of the most sincere and searching sort. In good company, there is never such discourse between 2 across the table as takes place when you leave them alone. In good company, the individuals merge their egotism into a social soul, exactly coextensive with the several consciousnesses there present. Unrelated men give little joy to each other, will never suspect the latent powers of each. We talk sometimes of a great talent for conversation, as if it were a permanent property in some individuals. Conversation is an evanescent relation, no more. A man is reputed to have thought and eloquence. He cannot, for all that, say a word to his cousin or his uncle. They accuse his silence with as much reason as they would blame the insignificance of a dial in the shade. In the sun it will mark the hour. Among those who enjoy his thought, he will regain his tongue. Friendship requires that rare mean betwixt likeness and unlikeness that piques each with the presence of power and of consent in the other party. Let me be alone to the end of the world, rather than that my friend should overstep by a word or a look his real sympathy. I am equally balked by antagonism and by compliance. Let him not cease an instant to be himself. The only joy I have in his being mine is that the not mine is mine. I hate, where I looked for manly furtherance, or at least a manly resistance, to find a mush of concession. Better be a nettle in the sight of your friend than his echo. The condition which high friendship demands is ability to do without it. That high office requires great and sublime parts. There must be very 2 before there can be very 1. Let it be an alliance of 2 large, formidable natures, mutually beheld, mutually feared, before yet they recognize the deep identity which, beneath these disparities, unites them. He only is fit for this society who is magnanimous, who is sure that greatness and goodness are always economy, who is not swift to intermeddle with his fortunes. Let him not intermeddle with this. Leave to the diamond its ages to grow, nor expect to accelerate the births of the eternal. Friendship demands a religious treatment. We talk of choosing our friends, but friends are self-elected. Reverence is a great part of it. Treat your friend as a spectacle. Of course, he has merits that are not yours, and that you cannot honor if you must needs hold him close to your person. Stand aside, give those merits room, Let them mount and expand. Are you the friend of your friend's buttons or of his thought? To a great heart, he will still be a stranger in 1,000 particulars, that he may come near in the holiest ground. Leave it to girls and boys to regard a friend as property, and to such a short and all-confounding pleasure, instead of the noblest benefit. Let us buy our entrance to this guild by a long probation. Why should we desecrate noble and beautiful souls by intruding on them? Why insist on rash personal relations with your friend? Why go to his house or know his mother and brother and sisters? Why be visited by him at your own? Are these things material to our covenant? Leave this touching and clawing. Let him be to me a spirit, a message, a thought, a sincerity. A glance from him I want, but not news, nor pottage. I can get politics and chat and neighborly conveniences from cheaper companions. Should not the society of my friend be to me poetic, pure, universal, and great as nature itself? Ought I to feel that our tie is profane in comparison with yonder bar of cloud that sleeps on the horizon, or that clump of waving grass that divides the brook? Let us not vilify, but raise it to that standard. That great defying eye, that scornful beauty of his mien and action, do not pique yourself on reducing, but rather fortify and enhance. Worship his superiorities. Wish him not less by a thought, but hoard and tell them all. Let him be to thee forever a sort of beautiful enemy, untamable, devoutly revered, and not a trivial conveniency to be soon outgrown and cast aside. The hues of the opal, the light of the diamond, are not to be seen if the eye is too near. To my friend I write a letter, and from him I receive a letter. That seems to you a little. It suffices me. It is a spiritual gift, worthy of him to give and of me to receive. It profanes nobody. In these warm lines the heart will trust itself, as it will not to the tongue, and pour out the prophecy of a godlier existence than all the annals of heroism have yet made good. The higher the style we demand of friendship, of course, the less easy to establish it with flesh and blood. We walk alone in the world. Friends such as we desire are dreams and fables, but a sublime hope cheers ever the faithful heart, that elsewhere, in other regions of the universal power, souls are now acting, enduring, and daring, which can love us and which we can love. We may congratulate ourselves that the period of nonage, of follies, of blunders, and of shame is passed in solitude, and when we are finished men, we shall grasp heroic hands and heroic hands. Only be admonished by what you already see, not to strike leagues of friendship with cheap persons where no friendship can be. Our impatience betrays us into rash and foolish alliances which no God attends. By persisting in your path, though you forfeit the little, you gain the great. Nature. There are days which occur in this climate, at almost any season of the year, wherein the world reaches its perfection, when the air, the heavenly bodies, and the earth make a harmony, as if nature would indulge her offspring. When, in these bleak upper sides of the planet, nothing is to desire that we have heard of the happiest latitudes, and we bask in the shining hours of Florida and Cuba, when everything that has life gives sign of satisfaction, and the cattle that lie on the ground seem to have great and tranquil thoughts. These halcyons may be looked for with a little more assurance in that pure October weather which we distinguish by the name of the Indian summer. The day, immeasurably long, sleeps over the broad hills and warm, wide fields. To have lived through all its sunny hours seems longevity enough. The solitary places do not seem quite lonely. At the gates of the forest, the surprised man of the world is forced to leave his city estimates of great and small, wise and foolish. The knapsack of custom falls off his back with the first step he takes into these precincts. Here is sanctity which shames our religions, and reality which discredits our heroes. Here we find nature to be the circumstance which dwarfs every other circumstance, and judges like a god all men that come to her. We have crept out of our close and crowded houses into the night and morning, and we see what majestic beauties daily wrap us in their bosom. How willingly we would escape the barriers which render them comparatively impotent, escape the sophistication and second thought, and suffer nature to entrance us. The tempered light of the woods is like a perpetual morning, and is stimulating and heroic. The anciently reported spells of these places creep on us. The stems of pines, hemlocks, and oaks almost gleam like iron on the excited eye. The incommunicable trees begin to persuade us to live with them and quit our life of solemn trifles. Here no history or church or state is interpolated on the divine sky and the immortal year. How easily we might walk onward into the opening landscape, absorbed by new pictures and by thoughts fast succeeding each other, until by degrees the recollection of home was crowded out of the mind, all memory obliterated by the tyranny of the present, and we were led in triumph by nature. These enchantments are medicinal. They sober and heal us. There are plain pleasures, kindly and native to us. We come to our own and make friends with matter which the ambitious chatter of the schools would persuade us to despise. We never can part with it. The mind loves its old home. As water to our thirst, so is the rock, the ground, to our eyes and hands and feet. It is firm water. It is cold flame. What health, what affinity! Ever an old friend, ever like a dear friend and brother when we chat affectedly with strangers, comes in this honest face and takes a grave liberty with us and shames us out of our nonsense. Cities give not the human senses room enough. We go out daily and nightly to feed the eyes on the horizon, and require so much scope, just as we need water for our bath. There are all degrees of natural influence, from these quarantine powers of nature, up to her dearest and gravest ministrations to the imagination and the soul. There is the bucket of cold water from the spring, the wood fire to which the chilled traveler rushes for safety, and there is the sublime moral of autumn and of noon. We nestle in nature and draw our living as parasites from her roots and grains, and we receive glances from the heavenly bodies which call us to solitude and foretell the remotest future. The blue zenith is the point in which romance and reality meet. I think if we should be wrapped away into all that we dream of heaven, and should converse with Gabriel and Uriel, the upper sky would be all that would remain of our furniture. It seems as if the day was not wholly profane, in which we have given heed to some natural object. The fall of snowflakes in a still air, preserving to each crystal its perfect form. The blowing of sleet over a wide sheet of water, and over plains. The waving rye field, the mimic waving of acres of houstonia, whose innumerable florets whiten and ripple before the eye. The reflections of trees and flowers and grassy lakes, the musical, steaming, odorous south wind, which converts all trees to wind harps, the crackling and spurting of hemlock in the flames, or of pine logs, which yield glory to the walls and faces in the sitting room. These are the music and pictures of the most ancient religion. My house stands in low land with limited outlook and on the skirt of the village. But I go with my friend to the shore of our little river, and with one stroke of the paddle, I leave the village politics and personalities, yes, and the world of villages and personalities, behind, and pass into a delicate realm of sunset and moonlight, too bright almost for spotted man to enter without novitiate and probation. We penetrate bodily this incredible beauty. We dip our hands in this painted element. Our eyes are bathed in these lights and forms. A holiday, a villeggiatura, a royal revel, the proudest, most heart-rejoicing festival that valor and beauty, power and taste, ever decked and enjoyed, establishes itself on the instant. These sunset clouds, these delicately emerging stars, with their private and ineffable glances, signify it and proffer it. I am taught the poorness of our invention, the ugliness of towns and palaces. Art and luxury have early learned that they must work as enchantment and sequel to this original beauty. I am over-instructed for my return. Henceforth I shall be hard to please. I cannot go back to toys. I am grown, expensive, and sophisticated. I can no longer live without elegance, but a countryman shall be my master of revels. He who knows the most, he who knows what sweets and virtues are in the ground, the waters, the plants, the heavens, and how to come at these enchantments, is the rich and royal man. Only as far as the masters of the world have called in nature to their aid can they reach the height of magnificence. Compensation. A man cannot speak, but he judges himself. With his will or against his will, he draws his portrait to the eye of his companions by every word. Every opinion reacts on him who utters it. It is a thread ball thrown at a mark, but the other end remains in the thrower's bag. Or rather, it is a harpoon thrown at the whale, unwinding as it flies a coil of cord in the boat. And if the harpoon is not good, or not well thrown, it will go nigh to cut the steersman in twain, or sink the boat. You cannot do wrong without suffering wrong. No man had ever a point of pride that was not injurious to him, said Burke. The exclusive in fashionable life does not see that he excludes himself from enjoyment in the attempt to appropriate it. The exclusionist in religion does not see that he shuts the door of heaven on himself in striving to shut out others. Treat men as pawns and ninepins, and you shall suffer as well as they. If you leave out their heart, you shall lose your own. The senses would make things of all persons, of women, of children, of the poor. The vulgar proverb, I will get it from his purse or get it from his skin, is sound philosophy. All infractions of love and equity in our social relations are speedily punished. They are punished by fear. Whilst I stand in simple relations to my fellow man, I have no displeasure in meeting him. We meet as water meets water, or as two currents of air mix, with perfect diffusion and interpenetration of nature. But as soon as there is any departure from simplicity, and attempts at halfness, or good for me that is not good for him, my neighbor feels the wrong. He shrinks from me as far as I have shrunk from him. His eyes no longer seek mine. There is war between us. There is hate in him and fear in me. All the old abuses in society, universal and particular, all unjust accumulations of property and power, are avenged in the same manner. Fear is an instructor of great sagacity and the herald of all revolutions. One thing he teaches, that there is rottenness where he appears. He is a carrion crow, and though you see not well what he hovers for, there is death somewhere. Our property is timid, our laws are timid, our cultivated classes are timid. Fear, for ages, has boded and mowed and gibbered over government and property. That obscene bird is not there for nothing. He indicates great wrongs which must be revised. Of the like nature is that expectation of change which instantly follows the suspension of our voluntary activity, the terror of cloudless noon, the emerald of Polycrates, the awe of prosperity, the instinct which leads every generous soul to impose on itself tasks of a noble asceticism and vicarious virtue, are the tremblings of the balance of justice through the heart and mind of man. Experienced men of the world know very well that it is best to pay scot and lot as they go along, and that a man often pays dear for a small frugality. The borrower runs in his own debt. Has a man gained anything who has received 100 favors and rendered none? Has he gained by borrowing, through indolence or cunning, his neighbor's wares or horses or money? There arises on the deed the instant acknowledgment of benefit on the one part and of debt on the other, that is, of superiority and inferiority. The transaction remains in the memory of himself and his neighbor, and every new transaction alters according to its nature their relation to each other. He may soon come to see that he had better have broken his own bones than to have ridden in his neighbor's coach, and that the highest price he can pay for a thing is to ask for it. A wise man will extend this lesson to all parts of life and know that it is the part of prudence to face every claimant and pay every just demand on your time, your talents, or your heart. Always pay, for first or last you must pay your entire debt. Persons and events may stand for a time between you and justice, but it is only a postponement. You must pay at last your own debt. If you are wise, you will dread a prosperity which only loads you with more. Benefit is the end of nature, but for every benefit which you receive, a tax is levied. He is great who confers the most benefits. He is base, and that is the one base thing in the universe, to receive favors and render none. In the order of nature, we cannot render benefits to those from whom we receive them, or only seldom. But the benefit we receive must be rendered again, line for line, deed for deed, cent for cent, to somebody. Beware of too much good staying in your hand. It will fast corrupt and worm worms. Pay it away quickly in some sort. End of section 37. Recording by Colleen McMahon.
Section 38 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rita Boutros. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. Edited by Charles Dudley Warner. Section 38. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Part 2. Love. Here let us examine a little nearer the nature of that influence which is thus potent over the human youth. Beauty, whose revelation to man we now celebrate, welcome as the sun wherever it pleases to shine, which pleases everybody with it and with themselves, seems sufficient to itself. The lover cannot paint his maiden to his fancy, poor and solitary. Like a tree in flower, so much soft budding and forming loveliness is society for itself, and she teaches his eye why beauty was pictured with loves and graces attending her steps. Her existence makes the world rich. Though she extrudes all other persons from his attention as cheap and unworthy, she indemnifies him by carrying out her own being into somewhat impersonal, large mundane, so that the maiden stands to him for a representative of all select things and virtues. For that reason, the lover never sees personal resemblances in his mistress to her kindred or to others. His friends find in her a likeness to her mother, or her sisters, or to persons not of her blood. The lover sees no resemblance except to summer evenings and diamond mornings, to rainbows and the song of birds. The ancients called beauty the flowering of virtue. Who can analyze the nameless charm which glances from one and another face and form? We are touched with emotions of tenderness and complacency, but we cannot find whereat this dainty emotion, this wandering gleam, points. It is destroyed for the imagination by any attempt to refer it to organization. Nor does it point to any relations of friendship or love known and described in society, but, as it seems to me, to a quite other and unattainable sphere, to relations of transcendent delicacy and sweetness, to what roses and violets hint and foreshow. We cannot approach beauty. Its nature is like opaline dove's neck lustres, hovering and evanescent. Herein it resembles the most excellent things, which all have this rainbow character, defying all attempts at appropriation and use. What else did Jean Paul Richter signify when he said to music, "Away, away, thou speakest to me of things which in all my endless life I have not found and shall not find"? The same fluency may be observed in every work of the plastic arts. The statue is then beautiful when it begins to be incomprehensible, when it is passing out of criticism and can no longer be defined by compass and measuring wand, but demands an active imagination to go with it, and to say what it is in the act of doing. The god or hero of the sculptor is always represented in a transition from that which is representable to the senses to that which is not. Then first it ceases to be a stone. The same remark holds of painting. And of poetry the success is not attained when it lulls and satisfies, but when it astonishes and fires us with new endeavors after the unattainable. Concerning it, Landor inquires whether it is not to be referred to some purer state of sensation and existence. In like manner, personal beauty is then first charming and itself when it dissatisfies us with any end, when it becomes a story without an end, when it suggests gleams and visions and not earthly satisfactions, when it makes the beholder feel his unworthiness, when he cannot feel his right to it, though he were Caesar. He cannot feel more right to it than to the firmament and the splendors of a sunset. Hence arose the saying, "If I love you, what is that to you?" We say so because we feel that what we love is not in your will, but above it. It is not you, but your radiance. It is that which you know not in yourself and can never know. This agrees well with that high philosophy of beauty which the ancient writers delighted in. For they said that the soul of man, embodied here on earth, went roaming up and down in quest of that other world of its own, out of which it came into this, but was soon stupefied by the light of the natural sun, and unable to see any other objects than those of this world, which are but shadows of real things. Therefore the Deity sends the glory of youth before the soul, that it may avail itself of beautiful bodies as aids to its recollection of the celestial good and fair. And the man beholding such a person in the female sex runs to her, and finds the highest joy in contemplating the form, movement, and intelligence of this person, because it suggested to him the presence of that which indeed is within the beauty, and the cause of the beauty. If, however, from too much conversing with material objects, the soul was gross, and misplaced its satisfaction in the body, it reaped nothing but sorrow, body being unable to fulfill the promise which beauty holds out. But if, accepting the hint of these visions and suggestions which beauty makes to his mind, the soul passes through the body and falls to admire strokes of character, and the lovers contemplate one another in their discourses and their actions, then they pass to the true palace of beauty, more and more inflame their love of it, and by this love extinguishing the base affection, as the sun puts out fire by shining on the hearth, they become pure and hallowed. By conversation with that which is in itself excellent, magnanimous, lowly, and just, the lover comes to a warmer love of these nobilities and a quicker apprehension of them. Then he passes from loving them in one to loving them in all. And so is the one beautiful soul only the door through which he enters to the society of all true and pure souls. In the particular society of his mate, he attains a clearer sight of any spot, any taint which her beauty has contracted from this world, and is able to point it out. And this with mutual joy, that they are now able without offense to indicate blemishes and hindrances in each other, and give to each all help and comfort in curing the same. And beholding in many souls the traits of the divine beauty, and separating in each soul that which is divine from the taint which it has contracted in the world, the lover ascends to the highest beauty, to the love and knowledge of the divinity, by steps on this ladder of created souls. Circles. The eye is the first circle, the horizon which it forms is the second, and throughout nature this primary figure is repeated without end. It is the highest emblem in the cipher of the world. St. Augustine described the nature of God as a circle whose center was everywhere and its circumference nowhere. We are all our lifetime reading the copious sense of this first of forms. One moral we have already deduced in considering the circular or compensatory character of every human action. Another analogy we shall now trace, that every action admits of being outdone. Our life is an apprenticeship to the truth, that around every circle another can be drawn, that there is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning, that there is always another dawn risen on mid-noon, and under every deep a lower deep opens. There are no fixtures in nature. The universe is fluid and volatile. Permanence is but a word of degrees. Our globe, seen by God, is a transparent law, not a mass of facts. The law dissolves the fact and holds it fluid. Our culture is the predominance of an idea, which draws after it this train of cities and institutions. Let us rise into another idea. They will disappear. The Greek sculpture is all melted away as if it had been statues of ice, here and there a solitary figure or fragment remaining, as we see flecks and scraps of snow left in cold dells and mountain clefts in June and July. For the genius that created it creates now somewhat else. The Greek letters last a little longer, but are already passing under the same sentence and tumbling into the inevitable pit which the creation of new thought opens for all that is old. The new continents are built out of the ruins of an old planet. The new races fed out of the decomposition of the foregoing. New arts destroy the old. See the investment of capital in aqueducts made useless by hydraulics, fortifications by gunpowder, roads and canals by railways, sails by steam, steam by electricity. You admire this tower of granite weathering the hurts of so many ages. Yet a little waving hand built this huge wall, and that which builds is better than that which is built. The hand that built can topple it down much faster. Better than the hand, and nimbler, was the invisible thought which wrought through it. And thus ever behind the coarse effect is a fine cause, which, being narrowly seen, is itself the effect of a finer cause. Everything looks permanent until its secret is known. A rich estate appears to women and children a firm and lasting fact. To a merchant, one easily created out of any materials, and easily lost. An orchard, good tillage, good grounds, seem a fixture like a gold mine or a river to a citizen, but to a large farmer not much more fixed than the state of the crop. Nature looks provokingly stable and secular, but it has a cause like all the rest. And when once I comprehend that, will these fields stretch so immovably wide, these leaves hang so individually considerable? Permanence is a word of degrees, everything is medial. Moons are no more bounds to spiritual power than bat balls. The key to every man is his thought. Sturdy and defying though he look, he has a helm which he obeys, which is the idea after which all his facts are classified. He can only be reformed by showing him a new idea which commands his own. The life of man is a self-evolving circle, which from a ring imperceptibly small rushes on all sides outwards to new and larger circles, and that without end. The extent to which this generation of circles, wheel without wheel, will go, depends on the force or truth of the individual soul. For it is the inert effort of each thought, having formed itself into a circular wave of circumstance, as for instance an empire, rules of an art, a local usage, a religious rite, to heap itself on that ridge, and to solidify and hem in the life. But if the soul is quick and strong, it bursts over that boundary on all sides, and expands another orbit on the great deep, which also runs up into a high wave, with attempt again to stop and to bind. But the heart refuses to be imprisoned. In its first and narrowest pulses it already tends outward with a vast force, and to immense and innumerable expansions. Every ultimate fact is only the first of a new series, every general law only a particular fact of some more general law presently to disclose itself. There is no outside, no enclosing wall, no circumference to us. The man finishes his story. How good, how final, how it puts a new face on all things. He fills the sky. Lo, on the other side rises also a man, and draws a circle around the circle we had just pronounced the outline of the sphere. Then already is our first speaker not man, but only a first speaker. His only redress is forthwith to draw a circle outside of his antagonist. And so men do by themselves. The result of today, which haunts the mind and cannot be escaped, will presently be abridged into a word, and the principle that seemed to explain nature will itself be included as one example of a bolder generalization. In the thought of tomorrow there is a power to upheave all thy creed, all the creeds, all the literatures of the nations, and marshal thee to a heaven which no epic dream has yet depicted. Every man is not so much a workman in the world as he is a suggestion of that he should be. Men walk as prophecies of the next age. Step by step we scale this mysterious ladder. The steps are actions, the new prospect is power. Every several result is threatened and judged by that which follows. Everyone seems to be contradicted by the new. It is only limited by the new. The new statement is always hated by the old, and to those dwelling in the old comes like an abyss of skepticism. But the eye soon gets wonted to it, for the eye and it are effects of one cause. Then its innocency and benefit appear, and presently, all its energy spent, it pales and dwindles before the revelation of the new hour. Self-reliance. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Great men have always done so, and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age, betraying their perception that the absolutely trustworthy was seated at their heart, working through their hands, predominating in all their being. And we are now men, and must accept in the highest mind the same transcendent destiny, and not minors and invalids in a protected corner, not cowards fleeing before a revolution, but guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the almighty effort, and advancing on chaos and the dark. What pretty oracles nature yields us on this text in the face and behavior of children, babes, and even brutes! That divided and rebel mind, that distrust of a sentiment because our arithmetic has computed the strength and means opposed to our purpose, these have not. Their mind being whole, their eye is as yet unconquered, and when we look in their faces, we are disconcerted. Infancy conforms to nobody, all conform to it, so that one babe commonly makes 4 or 5 out of the adults who prattle and play to it. So God has armed youth and puberty and manhood no less with its own piquancy and charm, and made it enviable and gracious, and its claims not to be put by, if it will stand by itself. Do not think the youth has no force, because he cannot speak to you and me. Hark! In the next room the voice is sufficiently clear and emphatic. It seems he knows how to speak to his contemporaries. Bashful or bold then, he will know how to make us seniors very unnecessary. The nonchalance of boys who are sure of a dinner, and would disdain as much as a lord to do or say aught to conciliate one, is the healthy attitude of human nature. A boy is in the parlor what the pit is in the playhouse, independent, irresponsible, looking out from his corner on such people and facts as pass by. He tries and sentences them on their merits, in the swift summary way of boys, as good, bad, interesting, silly, eloquent, troublesome. He cumbers himself never about consequences, about interests. He gives an independent, genuine verdict. You must court him, he does not court you. But the man is, as it were, clapped into jail by his consciousness. As soon as he has once acted or spoken with éclat, he is a committed person, watched by the sympathy or the hatred of hundreds, whose affections must now enter into his account. There is no lethe for this. Ah, that he could pass again into his neutrality! Who can thus avoid all pledges, and having observed, observe again, from the same unaffected, unbiased, unbribable, unaffrighted innocence, must always be formidable. He would utter opinions on all passing affairs, which being seen to be not private but necessary, would sink like darts into the ear of men, and put them in fear. These are the voices which we hear in solitude, but they grow faint and inaudible as we enter into the world. Society everywhere is in conspiracy against the manhood of every one of its members. Society is a joint stock company in which the members agree, for the better securing of his bread to each shareholder, to surrender the liberty and culture of the eater. The virtue in most request is conformity. Self-reliance is its aversion. It loves not realities and creators, but names and customs. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. He who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve you to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world. I remember an answer which, when quite young, I was prompted to make to a valued adviser, who was wont to importune me with the dear old doctrines of the Church. On my saying, "What have I to do with the sacredness of traditions, if I live wholly from within?" my friend suggested, "But these impulses may be from below, not from above." I replied, "They do not seem to me to be such, but if I am the devil's child, I will live then from the devil. No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names, very readily transferable to that or this. The only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong what is against it. A man is to carry himself in the presence of all opposition as if everything were titular and ephemeral but he. I am ashamed to think how easily we capitulate to badges and names, to large societies and dead institutions. Every decent and well-spoken individual affects and sways me more than is right. I ought to go upright and vital, and speak the rude truth in all ways. If malice and vanity wear the coat of philanthropy, shall that pass? If an angry bigot assumes this bountiful cause of abolition, and comes to me with his last news from Barbados, why should I not say to him, Go, love thy infant, love thy wood chopper, be good-natured and modest, have that grace, and never varnish your hard, uncharitable ambition with this incredible tenderness for black folk 1,000 miles off. Thy love afar is spite at home. Rough and graceless would be such greeting, but truth is handsomer than the affectation of love. Your goodness must have some edge to it, else it is none. The doctrine of hatred must be preached as the counteraction of the doctrine of love, when that pules and whines. I shun father and mother and wife and brother when my genius calls me. I would write on the lintels of the doorpost, Whim. I hope it is somewhat better than whim at last, but we cannot spend the day in explanation. Expect me not to show cause why I seek or why I exclude company. Then again, do not tell me, as a good man did to-day, of my obligation to put all poor men in good situations. Are they my poor? I tell thee, thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such men as do not belong to me, and to whom I do not belong. There is a class of persons to whom by all spiritual affinity I am bought and sold. For them I will go to prison if need be. But your miscellaneous popular charities, the education at college of fools, the building of meeting-houses to the vain end to which many now stand, alms to sots, and the thousand-fold relief societies, though I confess with shame I sometimes succumb and give the dollar, it is a wicked dollar, which by and by I shall have the manhood to withhold. What I must do is all that concerns me, not what the people think. This rule, equally arduous in actual and in intellectual life, may serve for the whole distinction between greatness and meanness. It is the harder because you will always find those who think they know what is your duty better than you know it. It is easy in the world to live after the world's opinion. It is easy in solitude to live after our own. But the great man is he who in the midst of the crowd keeps with perfect sweetness the independence of solitude. History. Civil and natural history, the history of art and of literature, must be explained from individual history, or must remain words. There is nothing but is related to us, nothing that does not interest us. Kingdom, college, tree, horse, or iron shoe, the roots of all things are in man. Santa Croce and the dome of St. Peter's are lame copies after a divine model. Strasbourg Cathedral is a material counterpart of the soul of Erwin of Steinbach. The true poem is the poet's mind. The true ship is the shipbuilder. In the man, could we lay him open, we should see the reason for the last flourish and tendril of his work, as every spine and tint in the seashell pre-exists in the secreting organs of the fish. The whole of heraldry and of chivalry is in courtesy. A man of fine manners shall pronounce your name with all the ornament that titles of nobility could ever add. The trivial experience of every day is always verifying some old prediction to us, and converting into things the words and signs which we had heard and seen without heed. A lady with whom I was riding in the forest said to me that the woods always seemed to her to wait, as if the genii who inhabited them suspended their deeds until the wayfarer had passed onward, a thought which poetry has celebrated in the dance of the fairies, which breaks off on the approach of human feet. The man who has seen the rising moon break out of the clouds at midnight has been present like an archangel at the creation of light and of the world. I remember one summer day in the fields, my companion pointed out to me a broad cloud which might extend a quarter of a mile parallel to the horizon, quite accurately in the form of a cherub as painted over churches, a round block in the center, which it was easy to animate with eyes and mouth, supported on either side by wide-stretched symmetrical wings. What appears once in the atmosphere may appear often, and it was undoubtedly the archetype of that familiar ornament. I have seen in the sky a chain of summer lightning, which at once showed to me that the Greeks drew from nature when they painted the thunderbolt in the hand of Jove. I have seen a snowdrift along the sides of the stone wall, which obviously gave the idea of the common architectural scroll to abut a tower. By surrounding ourselves with the original circumstances, we invent anew the orders and the ornaments of architecture, as we see how each people merely decorated its primitive abodes. The Doric temple preserves the semblance of the wooden cabin in which the Dorian dwelt. The Chinese pagoda is plainly a Tartar tent. The Indian and Egyptian temples still betray the mounds and subterranean houses of their forefathers. The custom of making houses and tombs in the living rock, says Heeren in his researches on the Ethiopians, determined very naturally the principal character of the Nubian Egyptian architecture, to the colossal form which it assumed. In these caverns already prepared by nature, the eye was accustomed to dwell on huge shapes and masses, so that when art came to the assistance of nature, it could not move on a small scale without degrading itself. What would statues of the usual size, or neat porches and wings, have been associated with those gigantic halls, before which only colossi could sit as watchmen or lean on the pillars of the interior? The Gothic church plainly originated in a rude adaptation of the forest trees, with all their boughs, to a festal or solemn arcade, as the bands about the cleft pillars still indicate the green withes that tied them. No one can walk in a road cut through pine woods without being struck with the architectural appearance of the grove, especially in winter, when the barrenness of all other trees shows the low arch of the Saxons. In the woods, in a winter afternoon, one will see as readily the origin of the stained glass window, with which the Gothic cathedrals are adorned, in the colors of the western sky, seen through the bare and crossing branches of the forest. Nor can any lover of nature enter the old piles of Oxford and the English cathedrals without feeling that the forest overpowered the mind of the builder, and that his chisel, his saw and plane still reproduced its ferns, its spikes of flowers, its locust, elm, oak, pine, fir, and spruce. The Gothic cathedral is a blossoming in stone, subdued by the insatiable demand of harmony in man. The mountain of granite blooms into an eternal flower, with the lightness and delicate finish, as well as the aerial proportions and perspective of vegetable beauty. In like manner, All public facts are to be individualized, all private facts are to be generalized. Then at once history becomes fluid and true, and biography deep and sublime. End of Section 38. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Part 2.
Section 39 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13. Section 39. Selected Poems by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Each and All. Little thinks in the field yon red-cloaked clown of thee from the hilltop looking down. The heifer that lows in the upland farm, far heard, lows not thine ear to charm. The sexton tolling his bell at noon deems not that great Napoleon stops his horse and lists with delight, whilst his files sweep round yon alpine height. Nor knowest thou what argument thy life to thy neighbour's creed has lent. All are needed by each one. Nothing is fair or good alone. I thought the sparrow's note from heaven singing at dawn on the alder bough. I brought him home in his nest at even. He sings the song, but it cheers not now. For I did not bring home the river and sky. He sang to my ear, they sang to my eye. The delicate shells lay on the shore, the bubbles of the latest wave fresh pearls to their enamel grave, and the bellowing of the savage sea greeted their safe escape to me. I wiped away the weeds and foam, I fetched my sea-born treasures home. But the poor unsightly, noisome things had left their beauty on the shore with the sun and the sand and the wild uproar. The lover watched his graceful maid, as mid the virgin train she strayed, nor knew her beauty's best attire was woven still by the snow-white choir. At last she came to his hermitage, like the bird from the woodlands to the cage. The gay enchantment was undone, a gentle wife, but fairy none. Then I said, I covet truth. Beauty is unripe childhood's cheat. I leave it behind with the games of youth. As I spoke, beneath my feet the ground pine curled its pretty wreath, running over the club moss burrs. I inhaled the violet's breath. Around me stood the oaks and firs. Pine cones and acorns lay on the ground. Over me soared the eternal sky, full of light and of deity. Again I saw, again I heard the rolling river, the morning bird. Beauty through my senses stole. I yielded myself to the perfect whole. The rhodora, on being asked, whence is the flower? In May, when sea winds pierced our solitudes, I found the fresh rhodora in the woods, spreading its leafless blooms in a damp nook, to please the desert and the sluggish brook. The purple petals fallen in the pool made the black water with their beauty gay. Here might the redbird come his plumes to cool, and court the flower that cheapens his array. Rhodora, if the sages ask thee why this charm was wasted on the earth and sky, tell them, dear, that if eyes were made for seeing, then beauty is its own excuse for being. Why thou wert there, O rival of the rose, I never thought to ask, I never knew, but in my simple ignorance suppose the self-same power that brought me there brought you. The Humble Bee. Burly, dozing humble bee, where thou art is clime for me. Let them sail for Porto Rique, far off heats through seas to seek. I will follow thee alone, through animated torrid zone. Zigzag, steerer, desert cheerer, let me chase thy waving lines. Keep me nearer, me thy hearer, singing over shrubs and vines. Insect lover of the sun, joy in thy dominion. Sailor of the atmosphere, swimmer through the waves of air, voyager of light and noon, Epicurean of June. Wait, I prithee, till I come within earshot of thy hum, All without is martyrdom. When the south wind in May days, with a net of shining haze, silvers the horizon wall, and with softness touching all, tints the human countenance with the color of romance, and infusing subtle heats turns the sod to violets, thou in sunny solitudes, rover of the underwoods, the green silence dost displace with thy mellow breezy bass. Hot midsummer's petted crone, sweet to me, thy drowsy tone tells of countless sunny hours, long days, and solid banks of flowers, of gulfs of sweetness without bound, in Indian wilderness found, of Syrian peace, immortal leisure, firmest cheer, and bird-like pleasure. Aught unsavory or unclean hath my insect never seen, but violets and bilberry bells, maple sap and daffodils, grass with green flag half mast high, succory to match the sky, columbine with horn of honey, scented fern and agrimony, clover, catchfly, adder's tongue, and briar roses dwelt among. All beside was unknown waste, all was picture as he passed. Wiser far than human seer, yellow-breeched philosopher, seeing only what is fair, sipping only what is sweet, thou dost mock at fate and care, leave the chaff and take the wheat. When the fierce northwestern blast cools sea and land so far and fast, thou already slumberest deep. Woe and want thou canst outsleep, want and woe which torture us, thy sleep makes ridiculous. The Problem. I like a church, I like a coal, I love a prophet of the soul, and on my heart monastic aisles fall like sweet strains or pensive smiles. Yet not for all his faith can see would I that cold churchman be. Why should the vest on him allure which I could not on me endure? Not from a vain or shallow thought his awful Jove young Phidias brought, never from lips of cunning fell the thrilling Delphic oracle. Out from the heart of nature rolled the burdens of the Bible old. The litanies of nations came, like the volcano's tongue of flame. Up from the burning core below the canticles of love and woe. The hand that rounded Peter's dome and groined the aisles of Christian Rome wrought in a sad sincerity himself from God he could not free. He builded better than he knew, the conscious stone to beauty grew. Knowest thou what wove yon wood bird's nest of leaves and feathers from her breast? Or how the fish outbuilt her shell, painting with morn each annual cell? Or how the sacred pine tree adds to her old leaves new myriads? Such and so grew these holy piles, whilst love and terror laid the tiles. Earth proudly wears the Parthenon as the best gem upon her zone. The morning opes with haste her lids to gaze upon the pyramids. O'er England's abbeys bends the sky, as on its friends with kindred eye, for out of thought's interior sphere these wonders rose to upper air. And Nature gladly gave them place, adopted them into her race, and granted them an equal date with Andes and with Ararat. These temples grew as grows the grass. Art might obey, but not surpass. The passive master lent his hand to the vast soul that o'er him planned, and the same power that reared the shrine bestrode the tribes that knelt within. Ever the fiery Pentecost girds with one flame the countless host, trances the heart through chanting choirs, and through the priest the mind inspires. The word unto the prophet spoken was writ on tables yet unbroken. The word by seers or sibyls told, in groves of oak or fanes of gold, still floats upon the morning wind, still whispers to the willing mind. One accent of the Holy Ghost the heedless world hath never lost. I know what to say the Father's wise. The book itself before me lies, old Chrysostom, best Augustine, and he who blent both in his line. The younger golden lips are mine's, Taylor, the Shakespeare of divines. His words are music in my ear. I see his colored portrait dear, and yet for all his faith could see, I would not the good bishop be. Days. Daughters of time, the hypocritic days, muffled and dumb like barefoot dervishes, and marching single in an endless file, bring diadems and faggots in their hands. To each they offer gifts after his will, bread, kingdoms, stars, and sky that holds them all. I in my pleached garden watched at the pomp, forgot my morning wishes, hastily took a few herbs and apples, and the day turned and departed silent. I, too late, under the solemn fillet, saw the scorn. Musketaquid. Because I was content with these poor fields, low open meads, slender and sluggish streams, and found a home in haunts which others scorned, the partial wood gods overpaid my love, and granted me the freedom of their state, and in their secret senate have prevailed with the dear dangerous lords that rule our life, made moon and planets parties to their bond, and through my rock-like solitary want shot million rays of thought and tenderness. For me in sweeping showers, the spring visits the valley, break away the clouds. I bathe in the morn's soft and silvered air, and planted world and full executor their imperfect functions. But these young scholars who invade our hills, bold as the engineer who fells the wood, and travelling often in the cut he makes, love not the flower they pluck, and know it not, and all their botany is Latin names. The old men studied magic in the flowers, and human fortunes in astronomy, and an omnipotence in chemistry, preferring things to names. For these were men, were Unitarians of the united world, and wheresoever their clear eye beams fell, they caught the footsteps of the same. Our eyes are armed, but we are strangers to the stars, and strangers to the mystic beast and bird, and strangers to the plant and to the mine. The injured elements say, "Not in us," and night and day, ocean and continent, fire, plant, and mineral say, "Not in us," and haughtily return us stare for stare. For we invade them impiously for gain, we devastate them unreligiously, and coldly ask their pottage, not their love. Therefore they shove us from them, yield to us only what to our griping toil is due. But the sweet affluence of love and song, the rich results of the divine consents of man and earth, of world beloved and lover, the nectar and ambrosia are withheld, and in the midst of spoils and slaves we thieves and pirates of the universe, shut out daily to a more thin and outward rind, and loiter willingly by yon loitering stream. Sparrows far off and nearer, April's bird, blue-coated, flying before from tree to tree, courageous sing a delicate overture, to lead the tardy concert of the year. Onward and nearer rides the sun of May, and wide around the marriage of the plants is sweetly solemnized. Then flows amain the surge of summer's beauty. Dell and crag, hollow and lake, hillside and pine arcade, are touched with genius. Yonder ragged cliff has 1,000 faces in 1,000 hours. Beneath low hills in the broad interval through which at will our Indian rivulet winds mindful still of sanap and of squaw, whose pipe and arrow oft the plough unburies. Here in pine houses built of new fallen trees, supplanters of the tribe, the farmers dwell. Traveller, to thee perchance a tedious road, or it may be a picture. To these men the landscape is an armory of powers, which one by one they know to draw and use. They harness beast, bird, insect to their work. They prove the virtues of each bed of rock, and like the chemist mid his loaded jars, draw from each stratum its adapted use, to drug their crops or weapon their arts withal. They turn the frost upon their chemic heap. They set the wind to winnow pulse and grain. They thank the spring flood for its fertile slime, and on cheap summit levels of the snow slide with the sledge to inaccessible woods or meadows bottomless. So year by year they fight the elements with elements, that one would say meadow and forest walked, transmuted in these men to rule their like, and by the order in the field disclose the order regnant of the yeoman's brain. What these strong masters wrote at large in miles, I followed in small copy in my acre. For there's no root that has not a star above it. The cordial quality of pear or plum ascends as gladly in a single tree as in broad orchards resonant with bees. And every atom poises for itself and for the whole. The gentle deities show me the lore of colors and of sounds, the innumerable tenements of beauty, the miracle of generative force. Far-reaching concords of astronomy, felt in plants and in punctual birds, better the linked purpose of the whole. And, chiefest prize, found I true liberty in the glad home plain-dealing nature gave. The polite found me impolite, the great would mortify me, but in vain. For still I am a willow of the wilderness, loving the wind that bent me. All my hurts my garden spade can heal. A woodland walk, a quest of river grapes, a mocking thrush, a wild rose, or rock-loving columbine, salve my worst wounds. For thus the wood gods murmured in my ear. Dost love our manners? Canst thou silent lie? Canst thou, thy pride forgot, like nature pass into the winter night's extinguished mood? Canst thou shine now, then darkle, and being latent feel thyself no less, as when the all-worshipped moon attracts the eye? The river, the hill, stems, foliage are obscure, yet envies none, none are unenviable. From the Threnody. The south wind brings life, sunshine, and desire, and on every mountain meadow breathes aromatic fire. But over the dead he has no power, the lost he cannot restore. And looking over the hills I mourn the darling who shall not return. O child of paradise, boy who made dear his father's home, in whose deep eyes men read the welfare of the times to come, I am too much bereft. The world dishonored thou hast left. O truth's and nature's costly lie! O trusted broken prophecy! O richest fortune sourly crossed, born for the future to the future lost! The deep heart answered, Weepest thou? Worthier cause for passion wild if I had not taken the child? And deemest thou as those who pore with aged eyes short way before? Think'st beauty vanished from the coast of matter, and thy darling lost? Taught he not thee, the man of eld, whose eyes within his eyes beheld heaven's numerous hierarchy span the mystic gulf from God to man? To be alone wilt thou begin, when worlds of lovers hem thee in? To-morrow, when the masks shall fall that dizen nature's carnival, the pure shall see by their own will, which overflowing love shall fill. 'Tis not within the force of fate, the fate conjoined to separate. But thou, my votary, weepest thou? I gave thee sight, where is it now? I taught thy heart beyond the reach of ritual, Bible, or of speech, wrote in thy mind's transparent table as far as the incommunicable, taught thee each private sign to raise, lit by the supersolar blaze. Past utterance and past belief, and past the blasphemy of grief, the mystery of nature's heart. And though no muse can these impart, throb thine with nature's throbbing breast, and all is clear from east to west. I came to thee as to a friend. Dearest, to thee I did not send tutors, but a joyful eye, innocence that matched the sky, lovely locks, a form of wonder, laughter rich as woodland thunder, that thou mightst entertain apart the richest flowering of all art. And as the great all-loving day through smallest chambers takes its way, that thou mightst break thy daily bread with prophet, Saviour, and head, that thou mightst cherish for thine own the richest of sweet Mary's Son, boy Rabbi, Israel's paragon, and thoughtest thou such guest would in thy hall take up his rest? Would rushing life forget her laws, fate's glowing revolution pause? High omens ask diviner guests, not to be conned to tediousness, and know thy higher gifts unbind the zone that girds the incarnate mind, when the scanty shores are full with thought's perilous, whirling pool, when frail nature can no more, then the Spirit strikes the hour. My servant Death, with solving right, pours finite into infinite. Wilt thou freeze love's tidal flow, whose streams through nature circling go? Nail the wild star to its track on the half-climbed zodiac. Light is light which radiates, blood is blood which circulates, life is life which generates, and many seeming life is one. Wilt thou transfix and make it none? Its onward force too starkly pent in figure, bone, and lineament. Wilt thou uncalled interrogate, talker, the unreplying fate, nor see the genius of the whole ascendant in the private soul? Beckon it when to go and come, self-announced its hour of doom. Fair the soul's recess and shrine, magic built to last a season. Masterpiece of love benign, fairer that expansive reason, whose omen 'tis and sign. Wilt thou not ope thy heart to know what rainbows teach, what sunsets show? Verdict which accumulates from lengthening scroll of human fates. Voice of earth to earth returned, prayers of saints that inly burned, saying, what is excellent as God lives is permanent. Hearts are dust, hearts' loves remain. Heart's love will meet thee again. Revere the Maker, fetch thine eye up to his style and manners of the sky. Not of adamant and gold built he heaven stark and cold. No, but a nest of bending reeds, flowering grass and scented weeds, or like a traveller's fleeing tent, or bow above the tempest bent. Built of tears and sacred flames, and virtue reaching to its aims. Built of furtherance and pursuing, not of spent deeds, but of doing. Silent rushes the swift Lord through ruined systems still restored. Broad sowing, bleak and void to bless, plants with worlds the wilderness, waters with tears of ancient sorrow, apples of Eden ripe to-morrow. House and tenement go round, lost in God, in Godhead found. Concord Hymn, sung at the completion of the Battle Monument, April 19, 1836. By thy rude bridge that arched the flood, there flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmer stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. The foe long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror silent sleeps, and time the ruined bridge has swept down the dark stream which seaward creeps. On this green bank by this soft stream we set to-day a votive stone, that memory may their deed redeem, when like our sires our sons are gone. Spirit that made these heroes dare to die and leave their children free, bid time and nature gently spare the shaft we raise to them and thee. Ode, sung in the Town Hall, Concord, July 4th, 1857. O tenderly the haughty day fills the blue urn with fire. One morn is in the mighty heaven, and one in our desire. The cannon booms from town to town, our pulses beat not less. The joy bells chime their tidings down, which children's voices bless. For he that flung the broad blue fold o'er mantling land and sea, 1/3 part of the sky unrolled for the banner of the free. The men are ripe of Saxon kind, to build an equal state, to take the statue from the mind and make of duty fate. United States, the ages plead, present and past, in undersong. Go put your creed into your deed, nor speak with double tongue. For sea and land don't understand, nor skies without a frown see rights for which the one hand fights by the other cloven down. Be just at home, then write your scroll of honor o'er the sea, and bid the broad Atlantic row a ferry to the free. And henceforth there shall be no chain, save underneath the sea. The wires shall murmur through the main sweet songs of liberty. The conscious stars accord above, the waters wild below. and under through the cable wove her fiery errands go. For he that worketh high and wise, nor pauses in his plan, will take the sun out of the skies ere freedom out of man. End of Section 39. End of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 13.